The soft wind moves through the trees of the Virginia tidewater, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something ancient, an echo of beginnings. In the quiet hum of the wilderness, before the colonies dreamed of unity, a boy was born who would one day come to embody that dream. But tonight, there is no prophecy, no marble pedestal, no music of destiny, only the flicker of firelight across a wooden cabin, the steady breath of his mother, and the whisper of the Rappahannock River drifting through the dark. In this cradle of vast forests and uncertain futures, George Washington opened his eyes to a world still untamed, a world of boundaries not yet drawn, of empires colliding, and of men still struggling to define what honour and freedom truly meant. His life would not be a story of brilliance born, but of character forged slowly, painfully, through failure, silence, and the quiet weight of duty. He was born on the 22nd of February, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in a modest plantation house overlooking the wide, tidal waters of the Potomac. The Washingtons were not aristocrats, yet they were not poor either. His father, Augustine Washington, was a man of enterprise, part farmer, part iron founder, his life defined by work and the ceaseless management of tobacco fields that stained every hand in Virginia with both wealth and debt. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was strong-willed, proud, and fiercely devoted to the moral upbringing of her children. George's early years were shaped by a quiet mixture of expectation and simplicity. There were no formal tutors from London, no vast libraries to instruct him. Instead, he learned the rhythms of the frontier, how to read the clouds, measure distance across rolling fields, and sense the mood of the land. His earliest lessons were of patience, precision, and self-control virtues that would one day define him as much as any act of courage. At 10, he lost his father, a blow that carved into him a lasting reserve. Death was not a stranger in colonial Virginia disease. Accident and childbirth often took what they wished, but for a boy on the cusp of manhood, it stripped away the soft edges of childhood too soon. Without Augustine's guidance, George found himself beneath the strong, sometimes distant shadow of his mother. Mary demanded obedience, diligence, and restraint. She forbade idleness, and her stubborn discipline, though at times harsh, taught the boy to bear discomfort without complaint. Neighbours described the Washington children as serious, not gloomy, but steady. George was tall for his age, his posture straight, his eyes calm yet alert. He did not chatter, he listened. When other boys brawled or bragged, he watched them with quiet detachment, learning that silence was its own form of power. In these formative years, he absorbed the unwritten code of Virginia's gentry, a world obsessed with reputation, manners, and honour. Every gesture, every tone of speech, every act in public was weighed as evidence of one's worth. A man could be poor and still noble if he carried himself with dignity. But a man of wealth who lacked self-control was a disgrace. This world, steeped in British custom, yet far removed from British comfort, demanded a delicate balance between humility and pride. George's education was limited to basic arithmetic, geometry, and surveying, but he possessed a mind that sought structure he loved, the certainty of numbers, the precision of measurement, and the calm order of methodical thought. While others chased rhetoric or poetry, Washington found satisfaction in mapping in the art of turning wild lands into lines and distances, translating chaos into order. By his mid-teens, he began keeping copybooks filled with maxims and moral rules, aphorisms, he would rewrite dozens of times by candlelight. Among them were lines that would one day seem prophetic. Labour to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire, called conscience. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. These were not idle exercises for him. They were the early architecture of his character, a discipline he built alone, while others sought the easier pleasures of youth. In 1748, at 16, he left home to join a surveying expedition into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trip was commissioned by Lord Fairfax, one of Virginia's most powerful landowners and a man whose friendship would prove pivotal. For the first time, Washington left behind the gentle fields of the tidewater for the rugged wilderness beyond the Shenandoah. The land was wild, thick with forest, rivers swollen from spring rains, mountains veiled in morning mist. It was there that he began to feel the vastness of the continent, the endless frontier that stretched far beyond the British Crown's imagination. He rode through icy creeks, slept on damp ground, measured plots of land by starlight, and learned to read the world not through books, but through landscapes. Each ridge, each clearing, each bend of river became a sentence in a silent text only he seemed able to interpret. The wilderness, in all its rawness, gave him something no classroom could: self-reliance and calm courage. Among the rough settlers and trappers, Washington carried himself with quiet authority. He was young, but his demeanor measured, composed, and self-contained made men twice his age defer to him. He avoided loud talk and idle boasts. Instead, he spoke plainly, acted decisively, and expected the same from others. The backcountry taught him endurance. It also taught him the precarious nature of peace. For beyond the horizon lay lands contested by empires British, French, and indigenous nations, each with their own vision of sovereignty. He learned that maps were not just drawings of territory, they were instruments of power. Whoever defined the borders controlled the future. By the time he returned to Mount Vernon, Washington was not merely a boy of Virginia's plantations, but a young man marked by the quiet confidence of survival. His hands were calloused, his manners refined, his ambitions sharpened. He began to see himself not as a provincial farmer's son, but as a man destined for something beyond his station. Still, beneath that resolve lay a fragile tension class and opportunity. Virginia society, deeply hierarchical, was ruled by families with ancient English names and inherited estates. The Washingtons were respectable, but not exalted. George's older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, had married into the powerful Fairfax family, giving young George a glimpse of that rarefied world. Lawrence lived at Mount Vernon, the grand estate overlooking the Potomac, a place George came to love as home. Lawrence had served with the British military in the Caribbean and carried himself with an easy authority that George admired. It was through Lawrence that George absorbed the grace of command, not through lessons, but through observation. Lawrence spoke of the wide world, the might of the British Empire, the sophistication of London, the glory and peril of battle. For George, these tales were intoxicating. They awakened a yearning for meaningful service, a life beyond the quiet predictability of provincial existence. When Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis, George's loyalty and devotion were tested. He accompanied his brother to Barbados in 1751, their only voyage outside the American continent. The humid air and foreign disease made the experience a crucible. Washington contracted smallpox there, a sickness that left his face scarred, but also gave him lifelong immunity. It was another quiet gift from hardship. Lawrence's death the following year struck him deeply. George was only 20. In a world where men often measured success by inheritance, his brother's passing left him heir to Mount Vernon, an estate of land, labourers, and debts. But more than that, it left him a legacy of expectation. In grief, he turned inward. He began to study the art of leadership, devouring every manual he could find on military discipline, tactics, and etiquette. His fascination with order, already profound from his surveying, now turned toward the structure of armies, the codes of honour that bound soldiers, and the written forms of authority that governed them. To Washington, leadership was not simply command, it was moral gravity, a man's ability to restrain himself, to act when necessary, and to bear the consequences with composure. It was this self-taught philosophy that would later steady him when the world around him trembled with revolution. But before the legend, there was the youth. A youth shaped by wilderness and loss, by discipline and silence, by a longing for dignity in a world that often denied it to those without title. As the 1,750 seconds dawned, the colonies were changing. The frontier was pushing westward. Rumours of war drifted from the Ohio Valley. European empires were colliding, and with them came the first sparks of a conflict that would soon engulf the continent. In taverns and along muddy roads, men spoke in anxious tones of French encroachment and native alliances. For the British colonies, it was a distant problem. For young men like Washington, it was an opportunity, a chance to prove valour, to serve the crown, to make one's name in battle. He could not yet know that the coming war would be his first trial by fire, nor that it would teach him the terrible cost of pride and the fragile illusion of glory. But already, in the quiet fields of Mount Vernon, amid the scent of tobacco and river mist, George Washington carried within him the early blueprint of a destiny he did not yet understand. A boy once shaped by frontier winds, by the stern will of a mother and the ghost of a brother, was about to step onto the stage of history not as a conqueror, not as a genius, but as a man who would learn, stumble, and rise again until he became the very embodiment of the nation yet unborn. Lessons in honour. The river mists rose each dawn at Mount Vernon, veiling the hills and the half-cleared fields that stretched down to the Potomac's edge. Washington would stand at the porch rail, still young but already solemn, watching the slow light come through. He was barely 20, and now master of the estate that had once belonged to his brother. The sound of workers' tools rang from the tobacco plots. The scent of the soil, heavy with dew and iron, hung in the air. He studied every path and every fence line, as if order alone could quiet the ache that had followed him since Lawrence's death. The young man who had ridden through wilderness and mapped the unknown now turned his gaze inward, toward a different kind of wilderness, the slow testing of character that came with land, responsibility, and reputation. The Virginians among whom he moved believed that a man's worth was written not in what he said, but in how he bore himself under pressure. It was a silent theatre of poise and restraint, and Washington watched it with the same discipline he once applied to measuring creeks and ridges. He had learned early that appearances were currency. His clothes, the tilt of his hat, the way he bowed or sat in the saddle, all of it carried meaning. In a society still bound to British sensibility, a colonial gentleman's survival depended upon the subtle grammar of honour. For those born without ancient name or inherited title, the only path upward was through conduct, flawless, restrained, and visibly loyal to the code. Washington's notebooks from this period are filled with such codes, small commandments to himself: never speak ill of another, never interrupt, stand when a lady enters, keep temper hidden, master one's face. The Fairfax family remained a guiding presence in this education. Lord Thomas Fairfax, an ageing nobleman who owned vast tracts of the Northern Neck, had taken a paternal liking to the young man. The old lord's stone manor at Greenway Court became Washington's unofficial finishing school. There, among fox hunts and formal dinners, George learned the gentle arrogance of the English elite, the polished manners, the tone of command softened by courtesy. Yet he also sensed the fragility beneath it. The Fairfax world was one of grace, but also dependence on London fashions, on imported wine, on a distant crown that neither knew nor cared for these American heirs of empire. Washington's mind, shaped by labour and distance, was different. His silence concealed restless curiosity. He absorbed everything the way a seasoned host controlled a room without raising his voice, the way written letters could carry power equal to any sword, the way money flowed invisibly between merchants, planters, and debt collectors. Beneath that calm exterior, he was learning what it meant to navigate power without holding it outright. By 1753, the western horizon was no longer quiet. The Ohio Valley had become the stage of imperial tension. British traders pushed west from Pennsylvania. French forts appeared like dark teeth along the rivers. Between them stood native nations, the Seneca, Shawnee, Delaware, each with their own alliances and long memories of betrayal. Virginia's governor, Robert Dinwiddie, desperate to assert British claims, looked for someone reliable to carry a message deep into that contested wilderness. He needed a man disciplined yet expendable, loyal yet obscure. He found him in George Washington, just 21 years old. The mission was perilous: travel hundreds of miles north to deliver Britain's ultimatum to the French commander near Lake Erie. Washington accepted without hesitation. Here was the proving ground he had long awaited, not in drawing boundaries on parchment, but in the living theatre of empire. He left Williamsburg in October, his breath visible in the frosty dawn, accompanied by a handful of woodsmen and a young interpreter named Christopher Gist. The forests closed behind them like curtains. Snow fell early that year, and the rivers froze beneath thin sheets of ice. They pushed through thickets, crossed half-frozen creeks, slept under lean-tos of bark. Washington kept a journal, noting each bend of river, each encounter with native envoys, each gesture of diplomacy. When they finally reached Fort Le Boeuf, he presented the governor's letter to the French commandant, Jacques le Gardeur de Saint-Pierre, who received him with polite indifference. The French refused to withdraw. Washington left with their formal refusal tucked under his coat, his boots soaked through and his mind changed forever. On the return journey, he nearly died twice, once when a treacherous guide fired at him at close range and missed, another time when he fell into an icy river and had to cling to a log all night to survive. He recorded these ordeals without dramatics, but the experience etched something permanent into his temperament, an awareness that leadership was endurance, not glory. When he returned to Williamsburg in January 1754, the young emissary found himself briefly famous. His written report, crisp, factual, and restrained, was published and circulated in both the colonies and London. For the first time, the name George Washington carried weight beyond Virginia's borders. But fame was a double-edged thing. Within months, the frontier burst into war. Dinwiddie, impatient and eager to assert dominance, ordered Washington to raise a small regiment and march west to confront the French presence. It was an impossible task. Ill-trained men, poor supplies, unclear orders. Yet Washington obeyed. The campaign that followed would scar him deeply. In May 1754, near the fork of the Ohio River, his men clashed with a French patrol. In the confusion, shots rang out. Among the dead was Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, a French officer bearing diplomatic papers. The skirmish, later called the Jumonville Affair, was, in truth, an assassination in the fog of misunderstanding. Washington, who had intended negotiation, found himself labelled an aggressor. The French vowed vengeance. Weeks later, his small force hastily built a crude wooden stockade they named Fort Necessity. Rain poured for days. Powder was soaked. Trenches collapsed. When the French returned with superior numbers, Washington's position was hopeless. After a day of fighting, he surrendered the only time he ever would. The surrender document, written in French, included a statement that he had assassinated Jumonville. Not fully understanding the language, Washington signed. When translated, the document became an embarrassment. In London, the French used it as proof of British aggression. It was a brutal lesson that ignorance, pride, and haste could undo even the most disciplined man. Washington rode home, humiliated, but not broken. For the rest of his life, he would carry Fort Necessity like a hidden scar, a reminder that dignity was most needed when dignity seemed lost. The following year, a British regular force under General Edward Braddock arrived to retake the Ohio Valley. Washington volunteered as aide-de-camp, eager to redeem himself. He rode at the general's side as they cut a long, slow road through the wilderness, dragging cannons over mountains. Braddock, proud and rigid, dismissed colonial advice. Washington, feverish with dysentery, tried to warn him of the dangers of ambush in narrow defiles. The warnings went unheard. In July 1755, as the army approached the Monongahela River, the forest exploded with musket fire. French and native fighters poured bullets from hidden cover. British ranks shattered in confusion. Horses screamed, men fled, drums ceased. Braddock fell mortally wounded. Amid the panic, Washington rallied fragments of the broken army. 2 horses were shot beneath him. 4 bullets pierced his coat, yet he remained untouched. The sight of the tall Virginian on horseback, calm amid the carnage, became legend overnight. It was not triumph but endurance that saved him. When the survivors stumbled back east, Braddock dead and the campaign ruined, Washington became the symbol of stoic resolve. His letters from that period reveal not pride but sober reflection. "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence," he wrote, "I have been protected beyond all human probability." Maybe for one, that brush with annihilation deepened his belief in fate, not as mystical protection, but as a burden of purpose. He began to move with the certainty of one preserved for labour yet to come. Over the next years, he commanded Virginia's frontier defences, riding endlessly between forts, quelling mutinies, arguing with the colonial assembly for supplies that never arrived. He learned the tedium of command, the endless logistics, the loneliness of responsibility, the quiet rot of frustration. The British officers above him sneered at colonial incompetence. The Virginia politicians beneath him refused to pay or feed his men, yet he kept the line from collapsing. In these wilderness years, his sense of honour evolved from the rigid etiquette of Fairfax salons into something harder, simpler, and distinctly American. It was no longer about polish or rank, but about the fulfillment of duty when no one watched. He also learned to temper his ambition. Denied a royal commission despite his service, Washington realized the invisible ceiling above colonial officers. To the British, he was still provincial, a man of no consequence in the eyes of empire. This insult, repeated quietly in official letters and decisions, lodged deep in him. Years later, when he stood against the very flag he once served, that memory would burn quietly beneath his composure. By 1758, the French and Indian War was turning in Britain's favour. Washington, weary and ill, joined the Forbes expedition against Fort Duquesne. The campaign was cautious and measured qualities he had come to respect. When the French finally abandoned the fort, Washington rode among the ruins and felt not triumph but exhaustion. The decade of wilderness struggle had taught him that victory often came too late to feel like glory. Returning to Virginia, he resigned his commission. At 26, he had seen more combat than most men of his class would in a lifetime. His hair had begun to thin. The idealism of youth had faded into the steady calm that would define him henceforth. He longed for peace, for the ordered rhythm of land and household. He turned back to Mount Vernon, to rebuild the estate, to cultivate prosperity, and perhaps to heal something within himself that war had eroded. But he carried from the frontier a new creed, unwritten yet indelible. Honour was not a matter of words spoken in drawing rooms. It was the endurance to act rightly when surrounded by confusion and fear. It was the stillness of command when all else broke apart. It was, above all, self-mastery. The lessons had come harshly. From Fort Necessity's humiliation to the Monongahela's chaos, each failure stripped away illusion. What remained was a man neither brilliant nor reckless, but disciplined, a man whose greatest strength was to endure without complaint. In the years that followed, this quiet philosophy would take root like oak beneath his character. It would guide him through the bitter winters of revolution, through betrayal, through the lonely corridors of power. For now, though, as the guns of the frontier fell silent and the smoke cleared over the Alleghenies, George Washington rode home through the golden autumn light, the wind in his coat, the dust rising behind his horse. He did not yet know it, but the hardest lessons of his youth, the humiliation, the restraint, the silent persistence, had already forged the very foundation upon which a nation would one day lean. A soldier's baptism. The long war in the wilderness had ended, but its ghosts lingered in every valley and along every stream of Virginia's western frontier. The forests that once echoed with musket fire and the cries of men now breathed in uneasy silence. The French were gone. The British flag waved triumphantly over the fort, once called Duquesne, now renamed Fort Pitt. Yet beneath the surface, the frontier still smouldered with tension, the wounded pride of displaced tribes, the silent weariness of settlers who had survived years of blood and famine. For George Washington, the young soldier who had marched through that shadowed world, peace brought no triumphal sense of victory, only reflection. He was 26 and already burdened with the memories of campaigns that had shown him both the folly of pride and the fragility of human command. Though hailed as a hero by some, he knew too well how narrow the line was between survival and failure. The wilderness had taught him its cruel lessons, that men break easily, that courage without discipline is mere noise, and that fortune, fickle as weather, spares no one for long. Yet those same hardships had shaped him into something rare, a soldier who understood the cost of leadership. The scars of that education ran deep. His notebooks and letters from the late 1752 reveal not the voice of youthful vanity, but the measured tone of a man already practicing the art of composure. He wrote to friends of his desire for retirement and domestic quiet, but in the same breath confessed a restless stirring, as though the rhythm of peace was somehow too slow for the pulse that war had awakened in him. At Mount Vernon, life resumed its steady course. The estate, now fully his, demanded a master's eye. He rebuilt fences, reorganized fields, and began a methodical plan to restore its profits. Each morning, he rose before dawn, his boots echoing across the wooden floorboards, his mind turning not to battles or glory, but to the discipline of land. Tobacco, the lifeblood of Virginia's economy, drained the soil. Washington experimented with crop rotation, wheat, and new plows from England. He managed enslaved labourers with the same cold precision that he brought to military order, a paradox that would haunt his legacy long after his lifetime. Yet the rhythms of agriculture could not fully quiet the soldier within him. He sought purpose in structure, in duty. It was during these years that Washington began to build not only his estate, but his identity as a Virginian gentleman, modelled on the gentry of England, yet tempered by the realism of American soil. He practiced hospitality, corresponded with land agents, attended church in quiet formality, and entered the social circles that orbited around Williamsburg, the colonial capital of Virginia, where politics and power mingled over tea and tobacco smoke. It was there, in 1758, that he met Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow whose grace and intelligence matched the quiet gravity of his own. Their courtship was brief and unadorned. Martha, recently widowed and mother to 2 young children, found in Washington not romance, but stability, a man whose steadiness promised safety in a world that offered little of it. Washington, for his part, was drawn to her warmth, her refinement, and her ability to navigate the subtleties of social life that had long eluded him. They were married on a bright January day in 1759 at her estate, known as the White House Plantation near New Kent. The union was both personal and practical. With Martha came considerable wealth and the management of vast lands and enslaved workers. For Washington, it was a new chapter, one not of campaigns and battles, but of stewardship, domestic order, and the quiet performance of status. Marriage transformed him from soldier to planter, from servant of the crown to guardian of a world that was beginning to chafe beneath that very authority. He took his seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colony's elected assembly, where he was more observer than orator. Washington rarely spoke in debate. His presence alone, tall, grave, self-contained, conveyed the dignity he valued above persuasion. His voice, when he did speak, was deliberate and plain, stripped of flourish. He believed in example, not rhetoric. Yet even as he settled into civilian life, the frontier's lessons remained within him. The war had taught him to distrust both chaos and arrogance, to seek balance between authority and restraint. It had also opened his eyes to the inequities of empire. British officers had sneered at colonial troops, calling them undisciplined provincials. The Crown's generals had taken credit for victories that had been won through the blood of local men. The sting of those slights lingered. Washington's loyalty to the British Empire was still intact, but it had begun to thin subtly, like fabric worn by too many seasons. The 1,760 seconds unfolded slowly, yet history was beginning to shift beneath his feet. Across the Atlantic, Britain sought to tighten its grip on the colonies through new taxes and regulations, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and other levies that stirred resentment from Massachusetts to the Carolinas. In Williamsburg, taverns and churchyards, talk of injustice spread like wildfire. Washington, ever cautious, did not join the radicals, but his letters reveal growing frustration. He viewed British policies as both foolish and disrespectful, particularly toward men who had fought and sacrificed for imperial victories, only to be treated as subjects rather than partners. He began to speak quietly of liberty, not yet as rebellion, but as the natural right of those who had laboured and bled to defend their land. He did not yet dream of revolution, few did, but his sense of justice had begun to root itself in something deeper than loyalty to the crown. During these years, he refined his understanding of leadership. He learned that authority was most stable when it rested on trust, and that trust, once lost, could never be bought back. The British ministry, blind to this truth, mistook obedience for loyalty and law for respect. Washington, managing his estate and its many dependents, could see the difference firsthand. To him, leadership required restraint, not domination, a principle he would one day apply on a grander stage. But beneath the calm surface of plantation life, moral contradictions deepened. Washington, like most of his class, owned enslaved men and women whose labor sustained his growing wealth. In his account books, they appear as entries of property valued, listed, and traded. Yet in his private writings, small cracks of discomfort appear. The man who would one day fight for freedom lived daily amid its denial. It was a conflict not yet conscious, but presented dissonance between his ideals of virtue and the brutal economy of his world. By the late 1762, Mount Vernon had become a symbol of Washington's success and self-control. Visitors described him as reserved, polite, and meticulous in his habits. He avoided gossip and idle talk, preferring the company of serious men and long rides across his land. His temper, once sharp in youth, had cooled into something like iron, slow to heat, difficult to bend. He dressed plainly, yet with precision. His presence commanded quiet wherever he stood. When disputes arose with neighbours or tenants, he handled them with fairness and clarity. But there was also an unmistakable edge, a sense that beneath the calm exterior lived a will that did not yield easily. In his personal papers, he wrote that the integrity of a man is to be measured by his steady adherence to what he knows is right. This creed became his armour against uncertainty, and in the years to come, it would be tested beyond anything he could then imagine. In 1768, Washington purchased additional land and expanded Mount Vernon's holdings along the Potomac. The house itself began to take on the shape that the world would later know: wide verandas, pale wooden columns, the calm symmetry of Georgian architecture. Each beam, each pane of glass, reflected his obsession with proportion and order. Mount Vernon was more than a home. It was the physical manifestation of his inner discipline, a sanctuary built not of luxury, but of precision. Yet even as his estate flourished, his country trembled. The Boston protests against British taxation reached Virginia with whispers of defiance. Pamphlets spread across the colonies, calling for resistance. In 1769, the House of Burgesses passed resolutions opposing British taxes, and the royal governor dissolved the assembly in retaliation. The members met anyway, gathering at a local tavern, and signed a non-importation agreement pledging to boycott British goods. Washington, though not the loudest voice in the room, signed with deliberate care. It was a quiet act, but a profound one, the first visible fracture between his old allegiance and the new sense of responsibility stirring within him. The soldier who had once carried the king's commission was learning, step by step, what it meant to stand on his own. His loyalty was no longer to empire but to principle, to a sense of fairness rooted not in ideology but in personal conviction. He still spoke of the king with respect, still hoped for reconciliation, but in his private thoughts the balance was shifting. By 1770, the boy from the Virginia frontier had become one of the colony's most respected figures. His composure was now legend, his presence commanding yet quiet. Friends sought his counsel. Younger men watched him in silence, sensing that in his restraint lay a kind of strength they could not name. He was not yet the revolutionary hero the world would later remember. He was, in this moment, something subtler, a man standing between two worlds, neither of them fully his. Behind him lay the ordered world of empire, polished and predictable. Before him lay the uncertain expanse of change, and within him the lessons of a soldier's baptism, the endurance of fire, the humility of failure, the patience of command waited to be called upon once more. He could not have known that soon the echoes of muskets would return, not in the wilderness this time, but in the towns and farms of the very land he had fought to defend. Nor could he know that when the moment came, the quiet soldier of Virginia would be called upon again to lead not for the crown, but for the fragile, unformed idea of a nation yet unnamed, the burden of reputation. The years after Washington's quiet rebellion of conscience were years of deepening division across the colonies. The soil of Virginia was rich, but beneath it ran roots of unrest, slow, creeping, inevitable. Trade grew strained, tempers shorter. From Boston came stories of confrontation, blood, and protest, of British redcoats clashing with unarmed townsmen. In taverns and assembly halls, men spoke the words liberty and tyranny with a gravity that once would have seemed dangerous, even seditious. But George Washington remained outwardly calm, a man of composure amid swelling turbulence. He understood reputation as a kind of armour, one that had to be polished daily, never flaunted, never cracked. A single outburst, a careless letter, a rash alliance could undo what years of patience had built. His name, already synonymous with steadiness, was now his greatest tool and his greatest burden. Everywhere he went, whispers followed him. There goes Colonel Washington, the hero of the Monongahela. Others spoke of him as the richest planter in Fairfax County, the husband of Martha Custis, the steady hand in the Burgesses. Washington knew that this image, this idea of himself, was fragile. One wrong act could turn admiration to suspicion, and in Virginia's delicate social world, where men watched each other's gestures more closely than the weather, appearances meant survival. Still, beneath that serene facade, the restless soldier stirred. The British Parliament's Tea Act of 1773 and the Boston Tea Party that followed struck him not as the impetuous act of radicals, but as the symptom of something long festering. The government's retaliatory coercive acts, closing Boston's port and tightening royal control, were seen by the colonies as a punishment upon all. Even Washington, whose instinct was always for moderation, felt the insult keenly. He wrote to a friend, "The crisis is arrived when we must assert our rights or submit to every imposition that can be heaped upon us." For a man raised in loyalty to the crown, the words were seismic. They marked the quiet point of no return. Washington's life was measured now in dual rhythms, the domestic order of Mount Vernon and the growing chaos of empire. Each morning, he oversaw fields and ledgers. Each evening, he read the latest pamphlets smuggled down from Boston or Philadelphia. He studied not only the words but the motives behind them. His silence in these years should not be mistaken for detachment. Washington was measuring the times, as one might measure the rise of a river before a flood. When the First Continental Congress met in 1774, Virginia sent him as one of its delegates. He travelled north in plain riding clothes, carrying no pomp of office, but when he entered the hall in Philadelphia, his presence commanded instant attention. Tall, reserved, his every gesture precise, Washington was the embodiment of the sober courage that the colonies desperately needed. There, amid debates and fiery speeches, he found himself among men whose names would one day be etched into the nation's foundation. John Adams, sharp and unyielding. Patrick Henry, aflame with rhetoric. John Hancock, elegant and bold. Washington spoke little. He listened. When others thundered, he nodded. When tempers flared, he steadied the room by his mere composure. Later, one delegate wrote that while others talked of freedom, Washington looked it. The Congress called for unity, for the boycott of British goods, and for the creation of colonial militias should force be required. Washington returned to Virginia, sombre and resolute. His eyes were set. His path, though still unspoken, had begun to turn away from the crown he had once served with pride. Back at Mount Vernon, he donned his old militia uniform again, a symbol, perhaps, of what was to come. Neighbours visited him for counsel. He trained local volunteers quietly on his fields, teaching them the fundamentals of discipline, silence, order, obedience. His carriage became a familiar sight along the roads to Williamsburg, his letters filled with concern for the future. "Unhappy it is to reflect," he wrote, "that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast, and that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves." It was a prayer, not yet a declaration. In April 1775, gunfire cracked the dawn at Lexington and Concord. Blood had been spilled. The colonies were no longer petitioners, they were resistors. When the news reached Virginia, Washington was attending the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The atmosphere in the hall was taut with uncertainty. None yet dared speak the word independence, but all knew that the die had been cast. The delegates debated who should lead the ragged bands of militia gathering around Boston, where British troops now held the city. The name that rose, whispered at first and then spoken aloud, was George Washington. Not because he had sought it, he had not, but because his bearing alone inspired unity among fractious men. He wore his old uniform in those meetings, not by accident, but by quiet intention. To many, it symbolized readiness, modesty, and service. When, on the 15th of June 1775, the Congress formally appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, Washington accepted with the humility that would define his leadership. His words were brief. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honoured with." It was not false modesty, he truly believed it, but beneath the restraint lay steel. His entire life, surveying, soldiering, governing, enduring, had been preparation for this moment. That night, alone in his lodgings, he wrote to Martha, "You may believe me, my dear Patsy, when I assure you that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavour in my power to avoid it." Yet he accepted because duty demanded it. He left Philadelphia on horseback, the road stretching long before him. Crowds gathered as he passed, cheering not the man but the symbol, the quiet Virginian who now carried the burden of an unformed nation upon his shoulders. He said little. Those who rode with him later remembered that he often fell into long silences, his gaze fixed upon the horizon, his thoughts heavy. When he reached Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the militias had gathered to besiege the British in Boston, the sight that greeted him was sobering. There was no army, only a confused mass of farmers, fishermen, and tradesmen armed with hunting muskets. Supplies were scarce, discipline absent. Men came and went as they pleased. Officers bickered over rank and authority. It was chaos wrapped in hope. Washington surveyed the scene in silence. The lessons of his youth returned in force: the need for order, for respect, for restraint. He saw not what they were, but what they could become. In those first weeks, his every action was deliberate, controlled. He imposed structure where none existed, drills at dawn, inspections, strict records of rations and ammunition. He introduced cleanliness, rotation of duties, and the expectation that men would obey not from fear, but from respect. The transformation was slow, often resisted, but inevitable. He carried himself with the same measured dignity he demanded from others. Soldiers who met his eye described it as both stern and strangely reassuring. He rarely shouted. When angry, his silence was more powerful than any rebuke. Under his watch, the disorderly gathering began to shape itself into the skeleton of an army. At night, alone in his tent, he would read reports by candlelight, lists of desertions, requests for powder, letters of complaint, and he would write replies with steady hand. The burden was immense, yet he bore it as he always had, quietly. Those who served near him began to understand that his authority came not from charisma, but from restraint, from the discipline of a man who had mastered himself long before he sought to command others. Still, doubts gnawed at him. The British Army was the greatest in the world, with trained regiments, artillery, and a global empire behind it. His men were volunteers with no navy, no uniforms, no treasury. Yet Washington did not waver. His early defeats in the wilderness had taught him patience, the art of survival as victory. He would not waste his army in reckless glory. Instead, he would wear the enemy down, trading space for time, pride for endurance. As summer deepened, the first test loomed. The British, fortified in Boston, prepared to strike. Washington knew that the coming months would decide not only the fate of the colonies, but the meaning of his own name. For years, he had lived beneath the weight of reputation, a soldier, a gentleman, a Virginian, a loyal subject. Now he carried a different burden, the fragile hope of a people daring to imagine freedom. He would not ask for this destiny, but as history would soon learn, it is often the man who does not seek power who wields it most wisely. And so, as dusk fell over Cambridge, the tall figure in blue and buff uniform stood at the edge of his camp, the wind lifting his hair, his gaze fixed toward the city lights of Boston. The sound of hammers and saws echoed in the distance as his men built defences in the dark. The night smelled of earth and wood smoke and approaching storm. George Washington said nothing. He simply drew his cloak around him, took one long breath of the cold air, and stepped into the uncertain dawn of revolution. Mount Vernon and Martha, The winds that swept over Cambridge carried whispers of war, but far to the south, on the serene banks of the Potomac, Mount Vernon waited quiet, timeless, and unknowing. It was there, years before the thunder of revolution, that George Washington's life had settled into its most delicate balance between private peace and public duty. The estate was his refuge, his living reflection, a place that bore his character in every measured line and cultivated field. Yet beneath its calm surface lay the faint tremor of the world changing, one season at a time. Mount Vernon was not born of grandeur, but of steady hands. When Washington inherited it from his half-brother Lawrence, it was modest, a cluster of buildings perched on a bluff overlooking the wide, slow river. Over years of labour, he transformed it into an emblem of balance and order. Each addition to the house was deliberate. The symmetry of its facade, the sweeping piazza facing the water, the gardens that blended European design with the quiet wildness of Virginia soil. Every detail spoke of its master's precision. To visitors, the house appeared as a symbol of prosperity and grace. But to Washington, it was an experiment, a living discipline. He divided his lands into 5 farms, each with its own overseer, fields mapped by compass and record book. He measured crops in ledgers, as he once measured rivers. Wheat replaced tobacco, rotation restored the earth, efficiency was his creed. It was as if, having learned the chaos of battle, he sought to impose peace upon the soil. Yet this peace came at a cost unseen to many who admired the estate. More than 100 enslaved men, women, and children laboured on its fields, in its kitchens, and within its workshops. Washington managed their toil with the same cool precision that guided his other affairs, writing of them in terms of assets and yields. To his world, this was ordinary. But in the quiet hours of his later life, the contradiction between freedom and bondage would grow into an ache that no order could conceal. For now, though, he moved through those corridors believing, as many did, that slavery was a condition of the time, a burden to be managed rather than abolished. At his side was Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, whose presence lent the estate its warmth. She was not a beauty in the way poets describe, but she possessed something rarer: calm intelligence, easy dignity, and an instinct for grace. She balanced her husband's reserve with quiet wit, hosting dinners that drew Virginia's finest minds. Together, they formed the perfect tableau of colonial virtue. He, stoic and precise; she, hospitable and wise. Martha's wealth, inherited from her first husband, had secured Washington's rise among the gentry. Yet there was genuine affection between them. In their private correspondence, though restrained, a tenderness emerges, small endearments between lines of business and travel. She called him "my dear life" and "love." He, though less fluent in sentiment, wrote of longing to return home to domestic felicity. Their marriage was less a flame than a steady lamp, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared endurance. In the 1,760 seconds, Mount Vernon became a gathering place for Virginia's society, planters, merchants, and military men seeking advice or friendship. Washington's demeanour commanded both. He was not quick to laugh, but when he did, it was genuine. He avoided gossip, listened more than he spoke, and carried himself with a stillness that drew others into silence. At table, he spoke little of politics, preferring stories of horses, farming, and weather, yet everyone sensed the depth beneath his calm. Even in leisure, he seemed disciplined. In his study, lined with maps, instruments, and ledgers, he would sit long after the household slept, drafting letters or adjusting plans for the next harvest. The ticking of the clock, the faint hiss of the fire, the scratch of the quill, these were the sounds of his private world. The house around him breathed peace, yet his thoughts stretched far beyond its walls. Visitors often remarked on the rhythm of Mount Vernon life. At dawn, Washington rode through the fields, inspecting fences and barns. At noon, he dined simply usually cornmeal cakes or fish caught from the river. In the evening, he read newspapers from London or Philadelphia, his brow tightening at each new decree from Parliament. He never spoke rashly, but those near him noticed a growing impatience, a slow, gathering conviction that the colony's dignity was being eroded by distant arrogance. He was still loyal to Britain in those days, but that loyalty was no longer unquestioning. His correspondence with other Virginia planters began to take a sharper tone. He wrote of the policy of injustice that taxed without representation, and of the danger of tamely sitting down under such treatment. The seeds of rebellion were being sown not by fiery orators, but by men like him, measured, practical, and weary of insult. Still, he clung to moderation. Washington's instinct was always to balance extremes, to seek middle ground between defiance and submission. His life at Mount Vernon reflected that balance, ordered but never ostentatious, principled but not reckless. The rhythm of seasons became his silent meditation. Spring sowing, autumn harvest, the cycle continued, even as the world beyond his fields began to fracture. There were evenings when, after the day's work was done, Washington and Martha would walk along the riverbank, the sun sinking behind the hills, the air rich with the scent of honeysuckle. The water reflected the orange of dusk, and the house behind them glowed softly in the fading light. They spoke of family, neighbours, and the hope of peace. Yet in Washington's silence, there was the weight of something larger, a sense that this quiet life could not last. For even as he tended his fields, the drums of discontent beat louder. The Stamp Act protests, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, each event pulled him further from the old certainties. The British Parliament, in its blindness, mistook these scattered acts as isolated riots. But to men like Washington, they were the visible edges of a deeper truth, a people awakening. He began keeping careful track of every decree, every act of Parliament, his records as meticulous as his ledgers. He compared them not as a politician, but as a soldier, assessing the movements of an enemy. The liberties of mankind, he wrote, are not to be tamely given up by those who have any knowledge of their value. It was not rhetoric, but quiet warning. When Virginia's burgesses were dissolved for protesting the Crown's policies, Washington joined the boycott of British imports, refusing to purchase goods from London. At Mount Vernon, he began producing his own cloth, urging neighbours to do the same. The great house that once displayed English, china and fabrics now became a symbol of colonial independence, still graceful but stripped of pretense. During this period, Washington's reputation deepened from admired gentleman to moral example. His restraint made his convictions more powerful. In a time when anger spilled easily into words, he spoke only when words could not be avoided. Others argued Washington embodied resolve. Then came 1774, the year of the intolerable acts, the year when patience broke. The call for a Continental Congress reached Virginia, and once again, Washington was chosen as delegate. The fields of Mount Vernon faded behind him as he rode north toward Philadelphia. Martha watched from the veranda, her figure small against the columns. She understood what few wives of that time could, that this journey might alter their lives forever. In Philadelphia, the colonies found themselves bound by both hope and fear. Washington stood among them as the embodiment of steadiness. He did not speak first, but when he did, his words were measured and few. His silence gave them weight. He urged unity, discipline, sacrifice. When he returned home, his letters to friends carried the same tone. No man should scruple or hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a blessing as liberty. And so the planter, the husband, the quiet master of Mount Vernon, began to turn toward the destiny he had not sought but could no longer refuse. When war finally came the next year, it found him ready not in ambition, but in readiness of spirit. He left Mount Vernon, knowing he might never see it again. As he mounted his horse, Martha stood beside him, calm but pale. She said little, neither did he. They had lived long enough together to understand that duty often speaks louder than comfort. He rode away at dawn, the mist thick over the Potomac, the faint glow of the house receding behind him. Every step of his horse carried him further from the ordered world he had built, and deeper into the storm that would test every lesson he had ever learned. Behind him, Mount Vernon stood silent, the embodiment of peace, patience, and permanence. Before him lay war. But somewhere between those two worlds, between the hearth and the battlefield, between the gentleman and the General George Washington, would become something new, not just a leader of men, but the living ideal of endurance itself. Seeds of rebellion. The smell of gunpowder had not yet reached Virginia, but the tremor of conflict was already felt in every drawing room, every field, every quiet conversation held in the shade of great oaks. The old order, the one that had seemed eternal under the distant gaze of the British Crown, was beginning to loosen, thread by thread. The colonies were awakening to their own weight, their own worth, and the impossible balance between obedience and dignity was breaking apart. For George Washington, these were not years of loud rebellion, but of measured transformation. His heart remained calm, but his convictions hardened like iron under fire. It began quietly, as all great revolutions do, not with cannon fire, but with letters, meetings, and the subtle shifts of conscience. By 1774, the authority of Parliament had become unbearable in its arrogance. The intolerable acts, designed to punish Massachusetts after the Boston Tea Party, had shocked even the most loyal colonists. Ports closed, assemblies dissolved, soldiers quartered in homes, all symbols of power imposed by distance. Virginia, proud and self-assured, watched with growing unease. To punish Boston, the British had struck at the principle of all. Washington saw it clearly. To him, this was not a matter of Boston's merchants or Britain's taxes. It was a question of honour. Could a free man consent to be ruled by decrees issued across an ocean? Could any people retain virtue if they surrendered their right to self-governance? These were not abstract questions to him, they were reflections of the same discipline that guided his own life. Submission was weakness. Self-command was strength. Still, Washington did not rush toward revolution. His instinct was caution. He had seen what chaos could do to men and nations alike. The frontier wars had taught him that zeal without discipline only breeds ruin. So he moved with deliberation, weighing each step like a commander, advancing across uncertain ground. In May of 1774, when the Virginia House of Burgesses was dissolved for protesting British tyranny, Washington joined a private meeting at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. There, by candlelight and under the faint smell of ale, the Burgesses, now technically rebels, resolved to support Massachusetts and called for a Congress of the Colonies. Washington signed without hesitation. It was the first open defiance of his life, though his face betrayed no emotion. He returned home to Mount Vernon and began enforcing the boycott of British goods with the same precision he applied to his farms. Imported cloth, tools, and wines were replaced with local substitutes. "We must endeavour," he wrote, "to do our own business and manufacture what we can for ourselves." He dressed now in homespun, not London silk. The gesture was simple but profound, a declaration that dignity did not flow from empire but from labour. Neighbours came to seek his opinion, and his measured words became a kind of moral compass for the region. He urged restraint, not rashness, courage, not fury. "No man should wish more sincerely for peace than I do," he wrote, "but nothing but independence can keep the sword from our throats." The contradiction defined him, a man of peace preparing for war. When he rode north that summer to attend the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the journey felt almost sacred. 13 colonies, each with its own customs, laws, and rivalries, were sending men to sit beneath one roof for the first time. The road stretched long through forests and towns, across rivers that shimmered beneath early autumn sun. Wherever Washington passed, people gathered by the roadside. They called him Colonel, a title that clung to him like a prophecy. In Philadelphia, the air in the assembly hall was thick with anticipation. Some still clung to loyalty, others whispered of independence. Washington said little, but when he did, men leaned forward. His words were few, his posture composed. In the evenings, as delegates argued over trade and rights, he observed. He was learning again, this time not from maps or battles, but from men. By the time the Congress adjourned, his mind was decided. There would be no reconciliation without respect. The Crown would not grant it, and so America would have to claim it. He returned home to find Virginia already stirring. Militias drilled quietly in fields. Blacksmiths worked late into the night. Washington's estate became a meeting ground for local officers, his barn echoing with the clatter of muskets and shouted commands. His leadership was natural born, not of ambition but of trust. Men obeyed him because he never demanded obedience. He simply embodied it. Then came April 1775, and with it, the spark that lit the world. The British, marching on Lexington and Concord to seize rebel arms, met colonial fire instead. News spread like wildfire, galloping through the countryside on the lips of riders. By the time it reached Virginia, the colonies were no longer subjects, they were soldiers. Washington, then attending the Second Continental Congress, received the news in silence. He closed his eyes briefly, then rose and left the room. When he returned, he was calm, his mind already turning to logistics men, supplies, command. He wore his old Virginia uniform to the next session, a quiet declaration that he was ready. When John Adams rose to nominate him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, no one spoke against it. The room, divided on every issue but one, agreed without argument. Washington's face, composed as ever, betrayed only the faintest tension around the mouth. He stood, bowed, and said, "I beg it may be remembered that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honoured with." Yet he accepted. Duty, once again, outweighed doubt. He wrote to Martha that evening, his letter filled with tenderness beneath the restraint. "I am embarked on a cause which must draw upon me the envy and wrath of mankind. I shall rely, therefore, on that providence which has hitherto preserved and been bountiful to me." The next morning he left Philadelphia for Massachusetts. The road north wound through green hills and quiet towns, the air heavy with the smell of hay and summer dust. Crowds lined the way to see him pass. They shouted blessings, threw flowers, waved hats. Washington lifted his hand in silent acknowledgement, but spoke to no one. His thoughts were inward, steady, measuring the task before him. When he arrived at Cambridge and took command of the army surrounding Boston, what he found would have crushed a lesser man. The troops were a disorganized mass farmers with muskets, tradesmen with pitchforks, volunteers without discipline or uniform. Supplies were scarce, powder almost gone, yet Washington's face betrayed nothing. He looked across the ragged encampments, the smoke of campfires rising through the humid air, and said only, "We must act as one." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in transformation. He imposed order without tyranny, blending firmness with dignity. He established daily drills, introduced hierarchy, punished desertion with justice but without cruelty. Gradually, the chaos bent toward discipline. Men began to stand straighter when he passed. They saluted not just the commander, but the idea he represented, unity through restraint. He wrote endlessly to Congress for supplies, to governors for reinforcements, to his officers for accountability. His pen became a weapon sharper than any sword. Behind every letter was the same belief, that structure would win where chaos would fail. But he also understood morale, the quiet fire that no rulebook could ignite. He visited the sick, listened to grievances, and when food ran short, ate the same rations as his men. "A commander's example," he once wrote, "is more powerful than his orders." By the winter of 1775, the siege of Boston had settled into a long stalemate. Disease spread, tempers flared, and supplies dwindled. Washington bore it all in silence, walking among the tents each night, his cloak wrapped tight against the cold. He studied maps by candlelight, calculating each position, each line of defense. To those who saw him then, he seemed carved from stone, untiring, impassive, driven by something greater than fear or pride. When the British finally evacuated Boston in March 1776, Washington allowed no celebration. He knew it was not victory but a beginning, a breath before the storm. The empire would return, larger, angrier, relentless. The real war was yet to come. He wrote to his brother, "The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep. Few people know the predicament we are in." Behind those words lay the truth of leadership, the loneliness of command, the weight of thousands of lives resting upon one conscience. The seeds of rebellion had grown into roots. The colonies, once divided by accent, trade, and faith, were now bound by necessity. Washington had become their symbol, not through speeches but through endurance. He stood not at the head of an army, but at the center of an awakening. Each decision, each sacrifice, deepened his resolve. He began to see the war not as a contest between governments, but as a test of character, a moral struggle to prove that ordinary men could govern themselves without kings or masters. The lessons of his youth returned with new meaning, that restraint is strength, that dignity is power, that freedom must be earned through patience as much as through courage. He would soon face defeat after defeat, despair and betrayal, frost and famine. But in those quiet months of transformation, among the smoky hills around Boston, the foundation of his greatness was laid. The gentleman planter, the colonial soldier, the reluctant rebel, all dissolved into one figure, a man who embodied the calm conviction that liberty, once awakened, cannot sleep again. And so, as the year 1776 dawned, the horizon glowed with both promise and peril. In Philadelphia, a document was being written that would forever divide the old world from the new. In Cambridge, beneath the snow and the dim flicker of campfires, George Washington prepared himself and his men for the war that would test not only their courage, but the very idea of freedom itself, the reluctant commander. The summer of 1776 dawned hot and restless. The fields around New York shimmered with haze, and the streets buzzed with talk of independence. Rumors drifted through every tavern, every encampment. The Congress in Philadelphia was preparing to declare what most already felt in their hearts, that the colonies were no longer subjects, but a free people. Yet in New York, General George Washington stood on the edge of uncertainty, facing the greatest empire on earth with an army scarcely worthy of the name. He had not sought this command. When the Continental Congress placed the burden upon him, he had accepted it as a duty, not an ambition. In private letters, he admitted to friends that he felt unequal to the task. He knew that courage alone could not defeat experience, that enthusiasm was no substitute for supply lines, and that conviction would mean little against British cannon. Still, he believed something deeper could bind his men together, the quiet strength of purpose, the shared belief that freedom, once claimed, could not be surrendered. He arrived in New York in April, just as spring thawed the rivers. The city, restless and divided, was the next British target. To hold it was to hold the key to the Hudson Valley, the artery that connected New England to the south. Washington surveyed its defences with careful eyes: weak fortifications, inexperienced troops, unreliable militia. Congress demanded he defend it. Logic told him it was indefensible, but he obeyed, because duty rarely offers comfort. Each morning, he rode along the lines, tall, upright, his horse gleaming with sweat. His men cheered as he passed, though many had never seen him smile. They called him His Excellency, a title he neither encouraged nor refused. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the calm authority of a man who believed in discipline as salvation. By June, the British had arrived in force. The sails of their fleet blotted out the horizon, hundreds of ships, thousands of troops, the might of empire arrayed against a fragile dream. The sight alone could chill the bravest heart. Washington watched from his vantage point on Brooklyn Heights, silent. An aide, seeing the vast armada, muttered that the sight would make the strongest tremble. Washington replied only, "Yes, and it does make us tremble. But it is the cause, not the odds, that must carry us." The Battle of Long Island came swiftly and brutally. The British moved with professional precision, flanking the Americans in the dead of night. Confusion spread. Musket fire echoed through the smoke-filled woods. Washington rode among the chaos, rallying retreating men, his voice steady even as the line crumbled. When the order to withdraw came, it was his discipline, not victory, that saved the army. He refused to let panic turn into destruction. For 3 days, the army held on Brooklyn Heights, trapped against the East River, the British waiting for the fog to lift so their ships could strike the final blow. But on the night of August 29, as if guided by some quiet providence, a heavy fog descended, veiling the river and muffling every sound. Washington ordered an evacuation. Boat by boat, his army crossed the dark waters in silence, horses, cannon, men, all ferried beneath the ghostly mist. Washington himself was the last to leave, stepping into the final boat at dawn. When the fog lifted hours later, the British found the shore empty. It was not a triumph, but it was salvation. The Continental Army lived, and with it, the Revolution. Over the next months came retreat after retreat across Manhattan, through New Jersey, over the Delaware River. Each mile was a test of endurance. The men were ragged, barefoot, starving, enlistments expired, spirits broke, but Washington refused to yield. "Our only hope," he wrote, "is to wear them out." He rode among his men daily, cloak whipping in the cold wind, his face set with the same stern patience that had carried him through years of wilderness and war. When mutiny threatened, he confronted it with calm resolve. When supplies failed, he shared their hunger. When Congress wavered, he steadied it with letters written in the quiet hours of the night. By December, the army had dwindled to a shadow of its former strength, barely 3,000 men clinging to the Pennsylvania shore. Across the river lay the British and their Hessian allies, warm in their quarters at Trenton. Snow fell thick and steady, the air stung with frost. To many, the cause seemed lost. But Washington, pacing the banks, felt a strange calm settle over him. He had seen despair before on muddy battlefields, in the faces of dying comrades. He knew that men, like armies, could find renewal only through courage in the face of ruin. On Christmas night, as icy winds tore at the river, he gathered his officers. His plan was audacious: cross the Delaware under cover of darkness, march 9 miles through snow and ice, and strike Trenton before dawn. Some protested, others doubted. Washington simply said, "Victory or death." The crossing that night was one of endurance beyond measure. The river churned with broken ice, the boats overloaded and half frozen. Men wrapped their feet in rags, muskets drenched, spirits low. Washington stood in the lead boat, his posture unshaken, the wind whipping his cloak. The image, though, later immortalized in painting, was no romantic tableau. It was the reality of a commander who refused to let fear master him. They reached the far shore at dawn, hours behind schedule, the storm worsening. The soldiers marched through the snow, their footprints dark with blood. When they reached Trenton, the Hessians were still sleeping off their Christmas drink. The attack was swift and decisive. Within an hour, the enemy was routed, hundreds captured, and the impossible achieved. It was more than a victory, it was resurrection. The news raced through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Men who had lost faith now believed again. The revolution, nearly extinguished, blazed anew. Washington did not gloat. He knew the war was far from won. Within days, he struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force and retreating before they could retaliate. Then, exhausted and frostbitten, his men took shelter in the hills around Morristown. There, amid snowdrifts and hunger, the Continental Army endured another winter. Washington's leadership in those bleak months revealed the depth of his character. He was not a genius of strategy like Napoleon would later be, nor a brilliant orator like the politicians in Philadelphia. His greatness was quieter: patience, integrity, endurance. He understood that revolutions are not sustained by victory but by perseverance. "We must make the best of mankind as they are," he wrote, "since we cannot have them as we wish." He also understood the loneliness of command. In letters to Congress, he begged for supplies and reinforcements, often receiving little more than promises. "If I were to be called upon to draw a picture of the times," he wrote bitterly, "it would be a picture of weakness and of perfect impossibility of serving the public." Yet he never resigned. Each failure became another test of endurance. By 1777, his army was again on the move. They met the British in open battle at Brandywine, and later at Germantown, defeated in both, but not destroyed. Every retreat preserved the core of the revolution. Every narrow escape taught his men resilience. Each loss refined his resolve. That winter, they marched to a place that would forever define the spirit of his command, Valley Forge. There, amid the frozen hills of Pennsylvania, his men built huts from logs and mud, their clothes in tatters, their feet bare on the snow. Thousands fell ill, hundreds died. The smell of smoke and sickness filled the air. Yet through it all, Washington remained among them. He rode the camp daily, visiting the sick, speaking quietly to sentries, inspecting rations, sharing their suffering. He did not ask for loyalty, he earned it. When the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben arrived to drill the army, Washington gave him full support, understanding that discipline, not inspiration, would win the war. Slowly, through repetition and resolve, the army transformed from a band of farmers into soldiers. Spring came at last, and with it, renewal. The French alliance brought hope of supplies and naval support. The British withdrew from Philadelphia, and Washington's army pursued them north. At Monmouth, under blistering heat, his men fought them to a standstill the first time the Continental Army had faced British regulars as equals. Washington rode the field like a man reborn, commanding with calm precision, his voice carrying above the chaos. When the battle ended, the army stood unbroken. The war had turned. Yet, even in victory, Washington remained cautious. He knew the fight ahead would be long, the dangers internal as much as external disunity, jealousy, fatigue. His officers sometimes bickered, Congress often failed him, but he kept faith in the principle that had guided him from the beginning: steadiness above all. Through each test, the reluctant commander became something larger than a soldier. He became the embodiment of endurance, the quiet assurance that the cause of liberty could survive even the darkest winters. He would win not by brilliance but by character, not through genius but through the iron patience of one who understood that freedom, like the river he once crossed, is always found on the farthest, coldest shore, the winter at Cambridge. The smoke of gunfire had thinned above Boston, but the air of uncertainty remained thick and cold. The British fleet, though withdrawn for now, still loomed beyond the horizon, and the fragile army encamped around Cambridge waited hungry, anxious, and half-frozen for what would come next. It was not victory that filled their minds, but endurance. They had driven the enemy from Boston, yet the war itself had scarcely begun. For General George Washington, the months that followed would not be measured in battles, but in patience, persuasion, and the long education of men who had never before called themselves soldiers. The encampment stretched across the frozen fields like a city built of smoke and frost. Wooden huts stood shoulder to shoulder, roofs patched with straw and tar, doors fashioned from barrels and broken planks. At dawn, the smell of wet earth mingled with the faint scent of gunpowder and unwashed bodies. Drums sounded, boots shuffled, and men stumbled into ranks more out of habit than hope. The army was a patchwork of regions and tempers, farmers from Massachusetts, fishermen from Rhode Island, woodsmen from New Hampshire, and ragged volunteers from Connecticut. Each spoke in his own dialect, each carried his own musket, and all looked to Washington for proof that their sacrifices had meaning. He rose before the first light each day. Wrapped in his heavy blue cloak, he would step into the icy air and ride the perimeter of the camp, the steam of his horse rising into the mist. Soldiers who saw him pass noted how he seemed carved from the cold itself, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed far beyond the immediate hardships. He spoke little on these rides, but his presence alone steadied the men. In a world of hunger and confusion, his calm was a kind of shelter. The problems he faced were immense. Powder was scarce, muskets were mismatched, discipline was weak. Congress sent letters filled with encouragement but few supplies. The colonies, still thinking like separate provinces, squabbled over who should provide what. Washington spent hours each night writing reports, requests, complaints, instructions, all in the same precise, steady hand. He believed that order, once written, might conjure reality, that the very act of naming chaos could subdue it. He inspected every detail himself. Rations, drills, sanitation, the placement of sentries, nothing escaped his eye. To many officers, his insistence on structure seemed excessive. To Washington, it was salvation. He had seen what undisciplined courage looked like at Fort Necessity, and he would not let that lesson be repeated. "We must teach our people," he wrote, "that war is a science and not a passion." That winter, more than any other season of his life, revealed the essence of his leadership. He was not brilliant in strategy nor poetic in speech, but his quiet consistency became the spine of the army. When men grumbled, he listened. When they faltered, he reminded them, gently but firmly, of the cause they served. When they quarrelled among themselves, New Englanders mocking Virginians, and Southerners mistrusting the Northern officers he would walk among them, his calm presence dissolving resentment into silence. At night, the general's tent was rarely dark. Candles burned low as he studied reports and sketched plans upon rough maps. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, rattling the canvas walls. His aides sometimes found him standing by the small brazier, hands clasped behind his back, staring at nothing. They would speak softly of home, of wives and farms, but Washington's thoughts were far away on the men, freezing in their huts, on the vastness of the task before them, and on the quiet, almost unbearable loneliness of command. Even in hardship, he remained meticulous. When a soldier was caught stealing, Washington ordered punishment but forbade cruelty. "Let it be firm," he said, "but let it teach, not destroy." When a young officer quarreled over rank, Washington mediated with measured fairness, reminding him that honor lay not in title but in conduct. Through example, he was shaping not just an army, but a culture, a new understanding of leadership grounded in restraint rather than privilege. Cambridge in that winter became a crucible. Disease spread through the ranks: typhus, dysentery, fever. Food ran short, boots fell apart. Some soldiers deserted, leaving footprints in the snow that ended in the woods. Washington said little of them. He simply recorded the losses and carried on. "We must learn to suffer without complaint," he told his officers, "for our adversaries will not pity us." There were small mercies too. The people of Boston, newly liberated from occupation, sent what aid they could: bread, meat, wool, even candles. Local women nursed the sick and mended uniforms. Washington thanked them personally, though he often felt unworthy of their gratitude. In his letters to Congress, he never spoke of glory, only necessity. He understood that the fight for independence would not be won through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small acts of endurance repeated every day. He also faced the delicate task of politics. Congress, fearful of monarchy even in its own army, distrusted any sign of centralized power. Washington, conscious of this, moved carefully. He wrote deferentially, signed every letter, "Your obedient, humble servant," and made clear that he sought no personal ambition. Yet within his quiet tone, his resolve was absolute. He would not allow political vanity to ruin the cause. When Congress delayed sending pay for the soldiers, he appealed not in anger, but in logic. It is vain to expect that men who have given up the comforts of life should continue without reward or reassurance. As the months passed, the army began to change. Under his discipline, and with the arrival of a handful of skilled engineers and European officers, the camp took on the semblance of a real force. Trenches deepened, powder was redistributed, drills became sharper. The men who had once shuffled in confusion now stood in ranks, muskets gleaming, their faces lean and weathered. They had not yet learned to win, but they had learned to endure, and that was the greater lesson. In March, opportunity came. A young engineer, Henry Knox, had managed the impossible dragging heavy cannon all the way from the captured fort at Ticonderoga through hundreds of miles of snow and ice. The arrival of those guns transformed everything. Washington's eyes, usually reserved, gleamed when he saw them lined in the courtyard, iron instruments of defiance hauled by sheer will. With them, he could finally act. On the night of the 4th of March, 1776, under cover of darkness, Washington ordered the occupation of Dorchester Heights, the high ground overlooking Boston and its harbour. Thousands of men worked in silence, digging and hauling earthworks while muffled carts carried cannon up the hill. By dawn, the British awoke to find the heights bristling with artillery. Their position in the city was untenable. Their ships were trapped under the guns of the Americans. Within days, the British commander, General Howe, ordered evacuation. On March 17, the redcoats sailed away from Boston, their ships vanishing into the grey Atlantic mist. Bells rang through the city, church doors opened, and the people cheered until their voices broke. It was the first great success of the war, achieved not through brilliance or bloodshed, but through patience and nerve. Washington entered the city only briefly. He inspected the deserted fortifications, ensuring order, and then turned his thoughts to what came next. He knew that the British would return in greater force. and that New York, lying open to the sea, would be their next target. "We must prepare for the storm," he told his officers. "The enemy has only retired to renew the assault." That night, as he stood at the window of his quarters, looking out over the harbour where faint sails still glimmered in the distance, he allowed himself a single moment of quiet reflection. The sound of the wind against the glass reminded him of another time, his youth in the wilderness, when uncertainty was constant and survival never guaranteed. He thought of Martha, far away at Mount Vernon, of the peace he had left behind, and of the men sleeping in the cold streets below who looked to him as their anchor. He whispered to no one, "May Providence still favour this cause." Weekend 8. With the evacuation of Boston, the first chapter of the Revolution closed. The army, once a scattered collection of militias, had endured its first great trial together. Washington's transformation was complete as well. He was no longer simply a Virginian gentleman commanding volunteers. He was the commander of a nation yet unborn. The winter at Cambridge had taught him that leadership was not measured by victories, but by the ability to hold hope steady in the face of exhaustion. His soldiers, who had seen him ride through snow and fire alike without faltering, would remember that calm for the rest of their lives. In every battle that followed, through every defeat and triumph, they would look to him and find the same unbroken composure, the quiet assurance that freedom was worth every hardship. The winds of March carried the smell of thawing earth, and the roads to New York grew muddy with spring. Washington ordered the army to move, their wagons creaking under supplies, their muskets polished, their banners patched but proud. Ahead lay uncertainty, the long, grueling war that would decide the fate of generations. But behind them, the lesson of Cambridge remained, that courage alone cannot save a cause, but discipline, unity, and patience can sustain one through any winter. And so they marched east toward the coming storm, the snow melting beneath their boots, the sound of drums echoing through the hills. Washington rode at the head of the column, his cloak snapping in the wind, his face unreadable but resolute. The Revolution had survived its first great winter. Now it would have to learn to survive the world. The crossing, the winter of 1776, pressed hard upon the shattered American army. The sky seemed permanently grey, the air sharp enough to draw blood with every breath. The men who followed General George Washington through New Jersey were ghosts of soldiers, ragged, shoeless, their uniforms in tatters, their spirits worn thin by hunger and defeat. Each dawn found fewer men in the ranks. Each night brought new whispers of despair. Across the Delaware River, the British and their Hessian mercenaries sat warm and confident in their camps, certain the rebellion was dying in the cold. They believed the cause of independence was finished. Washington did not. The retreat from New York had been relentless. Since August, Washington had watched his army beaten at Long Island, pushed from Manhattan, harried through New Jersey, and driven at last to the icy banks of the Delaware. Every step backward had cost him dearly, men deserting, supplies dwindling, Congress losing faith. He had seen more retreat than victory, more silence than applause. Yet beneath the defeats, something within him hardened. It was not pride but purpose, the deep, immovable conviction that a cause could not perish so long as there remained one man willing to bear it. By December, only a few thousand soldiers remained. They huddled in makeshift huts along the Pennsylvania shore, their breath hanging like smoke in the night air. The river lay before them, wide and black, broken by slabs of ice that drifted downstream like silent blades. Beyond it, the fires of the enemy flickered in the distance, warm, bright, unattainable. Washington rode among his men daily, his horses' hooves crunching the frost. He spoke little, but his presence steadied them. His coat was patched, his gloves worn through at the fingertips, yet his bearing never faltered. He shared their hunger, their cold, their sleepless nights. When rations ran out, he refused extra provisions. When spirits sagged, he walked the lines, speaking softly. "The time will come, my friends. We must only hold." In those weeks, as 1776 waned, the Revolution balanced on the edge of collapse. Even Thomas Paine, the fiery pamphleteer, wrote by the light of a campfire the words that would echo across centuries. These are the times that try men's souls. Washington knew them to be true. Across the river, the British commander William Howe believed the war all but won. He ordered his troops into winter quarters and sent word to London of victory. The Hessians, left to garrison the small town of Trenton, drank, feasted, and celebrated Christmas under the assumption that the Americans, frozen and broken, were incapable of another fight. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also wrong, for in Washington's mind, retreat had reached its limit. The war could not endure another defeat, nor could he ask men to follow him further into despair. If the revolution was to live, he must strike not recklessly, but decisively, with the daring born of desperation. Victory or extinction, he told his officers, are the only alternatives. His plan was simple in idea, but immense in difficulty. To cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through snow and sleet, and attack the Hessians at Trenton before dawn. The element of surprise would be their only weapon. On the afternoon of the 25th of December, 1776, snow began to fall. The wind howled across the river, driving icy needles into exposed skin. Washington rode among his soldiers as they assembled near McConkey's Ferry, the grey light fading behind the clouds. His face, half hidden beneath his tricorn hat, was calm but grim. The river roared below, black and cruel. They began the crossing just after nightfall. Great wooden Durham boats, built for carrying iron ore, now bore men, horses, and cannon across the freezing current. The river was thick with floating ice, the wind fierce enough to tear sails and numb fingers to uselessness. Yet the men pushed on, guided by the faint glow of lanterns and the steady voice of their commander. Washington stood in the lead boat, silent, the storm whipping his cloak and hair. The oars creaked, the river hissed. Somewhere in the darkness, an officer murmured a prayer. It took 9 hours to complete the crossing. The last boat reached the New Jersey shore near dawn, long past the planned schedule. Snow turned to sleet, and sleet to freezing rain. Muskets would not fire, powder was soaked, men's hands bled from cold, yet Washington gave only one order: forward. The march to Trenton began through roads buried in snowdrifts and lined with ice. Some men wrapped their feet in rags, others left bloody prints in the snow. The wind howled like a living thing. But as the columns trudged on, word spread down the line that the general himself was walking among them, sometimes dismounting to help pull artillery through the drifts. Those who saw him later said his face was pale, but set with unshakable resolve. As dawn approached, the sky turned the colour of iron. Ahead lay the town of Trenton, its church steeple rising faintly above the trees. Washington turned to his officers. "We will march to the sound of the guns," he said quietly. The attack began just after 8 o'clock. The Hessians, caught in their quarters, stumbled into the streets half-dressed, muskets in hand. Cannon roared from either end of the town. Washington rode into the heart of the fight, his horse lathered with sweat, shouting orders that cut through the din like steel. The entire battle lasted less than an hour. When it ended, more than 900 prisoners had been taken, and the enemy routed. Not a single American life was lost in the assault. As the smoke cleared, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. The men, too stunned to cheer, looked to Washington. He dismounted slowly, his face streaked with powder and rain, and walked among the prisoners. He spoke to them, not as conqueror, but as soldier to soldier, offering them protection from harm. Then he turned to his exhausted men and said simply, "This is a glorious day for our country." That night, by the light of torches, the army recrossed the river with their prisoners and captured supplies. The men who had crossed half dead with hunger now carried muskets proudly on their shoulders, their eyes bright again. The cause, nearly extinguished, had found new fire. In the days that followed, Washington struck again, first at Princeton, then along the roads that wound through central New Jersey. His movements were swift, his judgment sharp. Each engagement, though small in scale, sent ripples of hope through the colonies. The myth of British invincibility was broken. Yet for Washington, triumph was tempered by humility. He knew the line between victory and ruin was thin. "Our affairs," he wrote to Congress, "are in a most critical state. Success depends on the constancy of our exertions." He forbade celebration beyond a single day of rest. The men repaired weapons, tended wounds, and buried the fallen. Washington himself spent the night after Princeton alone by the fire, writing letters by flickering light. His words to Congress were clear and restrained. "We have done what we could with what we had." But in his heart, he knew something larger had occurred. The victory at Trenton was not merely military, it was psychological. It proved that resolve could overcome despair, that leadership could ignite courage even in the bleakest hours. The army had crossed not only a river but a threshold. That winter, as snow continued to fall across the valleys and hills of Pennsylvania, the revolution began to breathe again. Recruits trickled back, farmers offered food, blacksmiths worked through the night forging new muskets. The dream of freedom, once dim, now glowed anew. The crossing of the Delaware became more than a daring maneuver. It became a symbol of transformation. It showed what endurance, guided by quiet faith, could achieve. It revealed the man at the heart of the struggle not as a figure of glory, but as one of unyielding patience. For Washington, it was not pride that filled him in those days, but gratitude. "The hand of Providence," he wrote, "has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel who lacks faith." In the years to come, he would fight greater battles and face darker winters, but none would test the raw fibre of his spirit as that frozen night upon the Delaware. In the storm and the darkness, surrounded by men who had lost everything but their belief in him, Washington had found the essence of command. He had learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. That hope, once kindled, can burn through any storm. And so the man who had begun that year retreating across frozen ground ended it crossing toward destiny. Behind him lay footprints filled with blood and snow. Ahead of him stretched the uncertain road of a nation struggling to be born. But for one brilliant, impossible night, George Washington had carried that newborn nation across the darkness and set it, trembling and alive, upon the farther shore. The Long War. The smoke of Trenton had barely faded when the long and grinding years of war truly began. The spark that had reignited hope on the banks of the Delaware had not yet grown into the steady flame of freedom. The British, humiliated by their defeat, gathered their strength like a storm over the horizon. For George Washington and his weary army, the next 6 years would be a march through exhaustion, betrayal, and endurance, an endless trial of body and spirit that would test the very meaning of perseverance. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had shaken the Empire's confidence, but they had not broken its will. By the spring of 1777, the British regrouped, landing fresh troops in New York and preparing to strike again. Their strategy was simple: crush the rebellion by isolating New England, the heart of resistance, from the southern colonies. One army, under General John Burgoyne, would march down from Canada along the Hudson. Another, under William Howe, would drive north from New York. If successful, the colonies would be split, strangled, and subdued. Washington saw their design clearly, yet he faced the same cruel arithmetic as always: too few men, too few supplies, too little time. His army numbered barely 10,000. Half were untrained recruits, the rest half-starved veterans. Congress, riven by argument, could offer little but words. He wrote letter after letter pleading, persuading, demanding, yet wagons remained empty and powder stores bare. He made his stand near Philadelphia, the seat of Congress and symbol of American unity. In late summer, the British landed at the head of Chesapeake Bay and advanced inland. Washington met them near the Brandywine River on the 11th of September, 1777. The morning broke hot and humid. Mist clung to the water, the fields alive with the hum of insects. When the battle began, it was chaos, cannon smoke rolling across the hills, muskets cracking, men shouting through the din. Washington rode through the storm like a figure carved from the same air. His voice, calm but firm, rose above the roar. Again and again he galloped toward the breaking points, rallying the line, steadying the frightened. But the British manoeuvred with skill, turning his flank and driving the Americans back. By dusk, the field was lost. Hundreds lay dead, the rest scattered through the woods. It was a bitter defeat, though not a rout. Washington withdrew his army intact and wrote to Congress that night, "The men are dispirited, but not destroyed. We will fight again." Weeks later, at Germantown, he tried to strike back. The plan was daring an assault through fog and confusion on the British encampment outside Philadelphia. The morning was thick with mist. Visibility was poor. Units lost their way. Allies fired upon each other, and what began as hope ended in frustration. Yet even in defeat, something had changed. The world began to see that the Americans, though often beaten, were never broken. Philadelphia fell. Congress fled westward to the small town of York. The capital of rebellion was gone, but the heart of the revolution still beat. And far to the north, Burgoyne's Grand Army met disaster at Saratoga, surrendering to General Horatio Gates. The victory shocked Europe. France, long an enemy of Britain and eager for revenge, now saw promise in the American cause. For Washington, it was a turning tide. He knew the war would no longer be fought in isolation. "We have it in our power," he wrote, "to begin the world anew." But before that new world could rise, his army had to survive another winter. In December 1777, they marched to Valley Forge, 20 miles from Philadelphia, and began to build their huts in the frozen wilderness. Snow fell thick and unending. The soldiers, wrapped in rags, trudged barefoot through the drifts. The ground was littered with bloody footprints. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Men boiled leather for soup and gnawed on bark to quiet their hunger. Washington lived among them, sharing their misery. He wrote by candlelight in a small wooden hut that shook with every wind. "To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness," he told Congress, "without blankets to lay on, and some without shoes, is a proof of patience scarcely to be paralleled." He begged for aid, yet his appeals went unanswered for weeks. The states quarreled over quotas. Congress, afraid of strong military authority, hesitated to grant him power. Even among his officers, murmurs of discontent spread. Some whispered that General Gates, flush with victory at Saratoga, might replace him. Others blamed Washington for the army's suffering. He answered none of it. His silence, once seen as stiffness, now became armor. He endured because he understood that the cause was larger than his own humiliation. In the heart of that cruel winter came a glimmer of salvation. The arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian veteran who brought with him the art of European discipline. With Washington's blessing, he drilled the men daily on the frozen fields, teaching them precision, formation, and confidence. Washington watched with quiet pride as ragged farmers learned to march like soldiers, their movements sharp and unified. "We are now forming an army," he wrote, "which I trust will yet do honour to the cause." When spring returned, the transformation was visible. The men stood taller, muskets gleaming, lines straight. They were no longer a mob, but a fighting force. The British, alarmed by French intervention, abandoned Philadelphia and began retreating toward New York. Washington pursued them, shadowing their movements across the scorched fields of New Jersey. At Monmouth Courthouse in June 1778, the two armies met in blistering heat. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their powder fouled by sweat. At the height of the battle, confusion nearly turned to disaster when one of Washington's generals ordered a retreat. Riding through the chaos, Washington met the fleeing troops head-on. His anger, rare and controlled, erupted. "Stand and fight," he commanded, his voice carrying above the cannon's roar. The men halted, turned, and reformed. Under his direction, they fought the British to a standstill. When the sun set, the enemy slipped away, leaving the Americans in command of the field. It was no grand victory, but it was proof that Washington's army could now meet Britain's finest as equals. The long humiliation of retreat was finally over. That night, Washington rode among the sleeping men, his horse's hooves sinking softly into the sand. He paused beside a campfire where a few soldiers lay wrapped in blankets, faces pale with fatigue. "You have done well," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You have done what was impossible." The war stretched on, year after weary year. The British shifted their focus southward, capturing Savannah and Charleston, hoping to rally loyalists there. Washington, tied to the north, sent generals to counter them, but refused to abandon the Central Army. "Where the army stands," he said, "there stands the Republic." There were moments of despair, rumours of mutiny, officers resigning, Congress bankrupt. At one point, he had to quell near rebellion among his troops by sheer moral force. He rode unarmed into the midst of angry soldiers and spoke with such calm conviction that tears replaced fury. "My friends," he said, "you will not ruin yourselves and your country for want of a little patience." They did not. Through it all, his relationship with Martha Washington endured as his single private refuge. Each winter she joined him in camp, bringing warmth, comfort, and a sense of home. She sewed clothing for the soldiers, nursed the sick, and sat beside her husband at the fireside, her presence a rare light amid darkness. "She is a soldier's wife," one officer said, "as much as the general is a soldier." In 1780, the world changed again. France formally entered the war, sending fleets and troops. The alliance brought hope but also complexity, new politics, new egos, new expectations. Washington, ever the mediator, balanced them with grace. He treated the French officers with respect, learning enough of their language to communicate without translators. He saw in them the proof that America's struggle had become more than rebellion. It was now a movement for human liberty, watched by all nations. Still, years of hardship weighed heavily upon him. His hair, once auburn, had turned almost white, his shoulders stooped slightly from endless riding, yet his eyes retained the same steady fire. "The war has not worn out my patience," he told Lafayette. "It has only strengthened my determination." By 1781, hope flickered once more. The French Navy under Admiral de Grasse threatened British control of the Chesapeake, while General Rochambeau's army marched north to join Washington. Together they devised a bold plan to trap the British forces under Lord Cornwallis in Virginia, but that victory, the culmination of all his endurance, still lay ahead. For now, Washington stood at the threshold of his longest trial. The war had ceased to be a campaign of battles and become one of will, the contest between an empire's pride and a people's persistence. As autumn settled over the Hudson Valley, Washington stood on a hill overlooking the river. The leaves turned gold and red. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and frost. Below him, tents stretched like a white sea, the living monument to 7 years of struggle. He thought of all who had fallen, of all who had endured. He thought, too, of what the future might demand. The long war had stripped him of illusions, but not of faith. "Perseverance and spirit," he wrote, "have done wonders in all ages." And in that quiet moment, as the last light of day faded over the river, the weary commander, once a surveyor's apprentice, a frontier soldier, a reluctant leader, stood at the edge of victory, not knowing when or how it would come, but believing still that it must. For if the revolution was a test of courage, the long war was a test of endurance, and endurance, in George Washington, was inexhaustible, the turning tide. The year was 1781, and after 6 relentless years of blood and uncertainty, the tide of the revolution at last began to shift. The war that had seemed endless, driven by hunger, frost, and despair, was now moving with new rhythm, new allies, and new purpose. For General George Washington, it was not the sudden swell of triumph that stirred him, but the quiet realization that time and persistence were finally turning the impossible into the inevitable. The alliance with France, forged through patience and diplomacy, had changed everything. For years, Washington had fought with little more than courage and hope. Now, ships bearing the white flag of the fleur-de-lis crossed the Atlantic, carrying not only soldiers and gold, but the promise of recognition. The world's oldest monarchy had chosen to stand beside the world's newest idea. France's intervention brought cannons, fleets, and experienced officers, but it also brought delicate politics. Washington knew that foreign aid was both blessing and burden. He welcomed the French commanders Rochambeau, de Grasse, Lafayette with careful courtesy. He understood that every handshake, every letter, every word had to balance gratitude with independence. "We are allies," he told them, "but we are not subjects." The young Marquis de Lafayette, once a boyish volunteer and now a seasoned officer, had become as close to Washington as a son, The bond between them was more than military, it was built on shared ideals and mutual respect. Lafayette adored him with filial devotion. Washington, reserved as always, let warmth slip through in brief, fatherly gestures. The war in the north had stalled into stalemate. Both armies, exhausted, watched each other across the Hudson River. The British held New York under General Henry Clinton, while Washington's army camped in the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, waiting for the right chance to strike. That chance came not in the expected place, but hundreds of miles to the south in Virginia, where Lord Charles Cornwallis had entrenched his army near the small coastal town of Yorktown. When word arrived that the French fleet might sail north from the Caribbean to challenge British control of the Chesapeake Bay, Washington sensed destiny approaching. The plan was daring: move the combined Franco-American forces hundreds of miles south, trap Cornwallis on the peninsula, and end the war in a single, decisive blow. But the plan depended on secrecy and timing. If the British in New York guessed his intent, the effort would collapse before it began. Washington spread false rumors, built fake encampments, and ordered deceptive movements to convince Clinton that an attack on New York was imminent. Then, in August 1781, he quietly marched his army away, crossing rivers, fields, and forests under cover of night, drums muffled, wagons moving like ghosts through the summer heat. The march to Virginia was a masterpiece of logistics and discipline. Over 400 miles of rough roads lay between the Hudson and the Chesapeake. The men, hardened by years of campaign, trudged southward in endless columns, dust on their faces, song in their throats, faith in their leader. Along the way, townspeople cheered, church bells rang, and farmers lined the roads with offerings of bread and cider. For the first time in years, hope felt tangible. Washington rode at the head, his blue uniform faded and patched, but his posture unbowed. Lafayette, galloping ahead, wrote to him almost daily with updates from Virginia. Cornwallis was fortifying Yorktown, and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was on its way. If all went well, the British would soon be trapped. In early September, as Washington's army neared Maryland, news arrived that de Grasse's ships had engaged the British fleet off the Chesapeake and won. The sea was theirs. The trap was closing. When Washington read the dispatch, his eyes, normally guarded, brightened. He clasped the messenger's hand and whispered, "The world is turning upside down." By late September, the combined armies, nearly 17,000 strong, surrounded Yorktown. The British, cut off by sea and hemmed in by land, faced encirclement. Washington set up his headquarters on a hill overlooking the town. From there, he could see the masts of enemy ships glinting in the sunlight, the smoke of their campfires drifting lazily above the trenches. He moved through the lines daily, inspecting the works, encouraging the men, and thanking the French officers in their own tongue. He was no longer the uncertain commander of Cambridge, struggling to discipline farmers into soldiers. He was the leader of nations. Even the French marquises and generals deferred to his calm authority. "He has the air of destiny," Lafayette wrote. The siege began on the 6th of October 1781. At night, the Americans and French dug trenches under constant fire, hauling earth and dragging cannon through the mud. Washington often joined them, shovel in hand, his presence transforming labour into inspiration. When a cannonball crashed near him, showering dirt across his cloak, he brushed it off and continued speaking as though nothing had happened. "Let us finish what we have begun," he said. On October 9, the bombardment opened. Dozens of cannons roared in unison, their thunder rolling across the river and echoing through the hills. For days, the earth trembled under the relentless fire. British redoubts exploded, walls crumbled, the night sky glowed orange. Washington watched from a forward battery, his face illuminated by the flashes of artillery. Each discharge shook the ground beneath him, yet he stood unmoving, his spyglass steady. When aides begged him to step back to safety, he refused. "If I am to fall," he said simply, "let it be with the men." The siege tightened. On the night of October 14, the Allies launched a coordinated assault on the two key British fortifications, redoubts 9 and 10. Lafayette led the Americans. French troops stormed the other. They advanced under darkness, bayonets fixed, muskets unloaded to preserve silence. Within minutes, the air erupted with gunfire and shouts. Washington, standing on the ridge, watched through his glass as his men climbed the parapets, fighting hand to hand. A distant cheer rose above the cannon smoke. The redoubts were taken. 3 days later, Cornwallis asked for terms. On the 19th of October, 1781, the British Army marched out between lines of American and French troops to surrender. The drums played a slow, melancholy tune known as "The World Turned Upside Down." Washington, mounted and solemn, watched in silence as the redcoats laid down their arms. He refused to accept the sword of surrender personally. Instead, he directed his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, to do so, an act of humility that spoke louder than triumph. When it was done, the fields of Yorktown fell silent. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. That evening, Washington retired to his tent and wrote to Congress. "I have the honour to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected." His words, as always, were measured, devoid of boast. But those who saw him later said that his hands trembled as he folded the letter. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of quiet joy. The cause for which he had endured defeat, frost, hunger, and despair was no longer a desperate dream. It had become history. News of Yorktown swept across the world. In Philadelphia, church bells rang through the night. In Paris, crowds gathered in the streets, cheering for Washington et Liberté. Even in London, silence fell across Parliament as the news arrived. The Empire's pride had been humbled by perseverance. Yet Washington, ever wary, cautioned against celebration. "Let us not grow insolent in success," he said. The British still held New York. Peace was not yet signed. He remained with his army through another long winter, watchful and patient. Only when word came in 1783 that the Treaty of Paris had formally recognized American independence did he finally breathe as a free man. The long war had turned, and with it, the course of human destiny. But for Washington, the victory at Yorktown was not an end, it was the beginning of a deeper burden. A nation had been born, and its survival would now depend not on arms, but on character. He looked out across the quiet fields of Yorktown, the air still carrying the faint smell of powder and the sound of distant waves. The sun was setting, its light turning the river to gold. He thought of the years behind him, the frozen nights at Valley Forge, the despair at Trenton, the endless waiting. And in that moment, the man who had been called General felt the weight of a new title forming in the future, the title that would bind his name forever to the idea he had helped create, not conqueror, but father of a nation, Yorktown. Autumn lay heavy on Virginia in 1781, a season of slow-burning sunlight and drifting wood smoke, when the fields turned the colour of tarnished gold and the river at Yorktown moved as still as glass beneath the haze. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder, of harvested corn and faraway thunder. In that suspended calm, history gathered itself for one last breath. The revolution had run its long course of exhaustion and faith. The armies that had circled one another for 6 bitter years were finally converging upon a single strip of soil where the fate of the New World would be decided. George Washington rode through the dawn mist, his cloak drawn tight against the chill. Before him stretched the encampment of 2 nations intertwined, the rough, weathered huts of his Continentals standing shoulder to shoulder with the white tents of the French. The tricolour and the banner of 13 stars lifted in the same wind, their edges frayed but proud. Campfires smoked between the rows, and the hum of morning stirred through the fields. The clatter of tin pots, the muted murmur of prayer, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. It was a strange, hushed harmony, the sound of men preparing for a day that would end an empire. For Washington, the march south had been a pilgrimage. Every mile from the Hudson to the Chesapeake had carried the weight of hope. He had left behind the familiar hills of New York, crossed the long rivers of Maryland, and entered Virginia, the soil of his birth and the stage of his destiny. When at last he reached Williamsburg, the old colonial capital, his horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones, townspeople wept openly in the streets. They had waited years for this sight. The Virginian come home to liberate his land. Washington acknowledged them only with a nod. His mind was already fixed upon the narrow peninsula, 30 miles ahead, where Cornwallis waited behind his fortifications at Yorktown. The general had not slept more than an hour that night. Maps and letters covered the table in his quarters. Every report was a fragment of the same fragile design: the positions of the French fleet under de Grasse, the depth of the British trenches, the number of guns, the state of supplies. He studied each line as if willing the future into order through the act of concentration. When the candle burned low, he stepped outside. The moon hung over the river, pale and wide, and from the distance came the faint rumble of cannon fire testing shots, echoes of the siege to come. Washington drew a slow breath and whispered, almost to himself, "So it begins." He had dreamed of this convergence for years. The revolution had survived not through triumphs but through endurance. Defeats turned to lessons, retreats into patience, despair into faith. Now, all of that long restraint had brought him here. Yorktown was not merely a battle, it was the sum of everything he had learned about command. The belief that courage was useless without control, that pride was nothing without purpose, and that providence favoured only those who laboured without certainty. By late September, the Allied armies surrounded the town in a crescent. To the east lay the river, and the British ships trapped by the French blockade. To the west stretched a line of trenches and redoubts bristling with cannon. Cornwallis's troops, nearly 8,000 strong, had dug themselves in, their camps clustered behind earthworks that snaked across the fields. Between the two armies lay open ground littered with the skeletons of fences and the smoke of burning farmhouses. The first days were spent in preparation. Engineers surveyed the soil, soldiers hauled timber and gabions, and teams of oxen dragged the great guns into position. Washington rode the lines morning and evening, noting each detail, with a surveyor's eye, the slope of the terrain, the angle of approach, the distance to the river. He spoke softly to the officers he passed, his voice low but decisive. Men straightened as he rode by, as though the very sight of him lent their weariness form. At sunset, the camp fell quiet, except for the occasional burst of laughter from the French tents and the melancholy notes of a fife drifting across the darkening fields. On the night of October 6, under a thin veil of clouds, Washington gave the order to begin the first parallel, the long trench that would bring the Allied artillery within striking distance. Thousands of soldiers moved silently into the darkness, spades in hand, their breath white in the cold air. The British guns fired blindly into the night, the shells arching like comets overhead, but the work continued without pause. When dawn broke, a fresh scar ran across the earth, an open wound creeping toward the enemy lines. Washington walked the length of the trench himself that morning. The men, seeing his tall figure appear through the smoke, cheered in weary voices. He lifted his hand in acknowledgement but said nothing. His boots sank deep into the clay. The air smelled of damp soil and burnt powder. At one point, a cannonball tore through the parapet only yards away, showering him with dirt. His aides urged him to step back. He refused. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, brushing the dust from his sleeve, "if the bullets are to spare me, I shall not lose them by ducking." The bombardment began 3 days later. On October 9, as the sun set over the river, Washington himself touched the fuse of the first gun. The flash lit his face in brief, fierce light, and a second later the earth shook with the roar. From that moment, thunder ruled the air. More than 70 Allied cannon answered in rhythm, their smoke rolling in white waves across the plain. British redoubts burst apart under the assault. Walls crumbled, wagons splintered, men scattered like ants through fire. For days the pounding continued. At night the horizon glowed orange, and the ground quivered beneath the endless rhythm of impact. The noise never ceased daylight, and darkness blurred into one long storm of sound. Washington barely slept. He moved constantly between batteries, offering a word here, a gesture there, his calm presence knitting the chaos into purpose. The men began to believe he could not be struck. Shells burst around him, fragments whistled past his head, yet he seemed untouchable, as if the war itself had agreed to spare its embodiment. Within a week, the British outer works were shattered. 2 remaining strongpoints, redoubts 9 and 10, stood like teeth at the edge of the line. Their capture would open the way to the heart of the enemy camp. Washington planned the assault for the night of October 14. The Americans would storm one redoubt under Lafayette, the French would take the other. There would be no artillery, no warning, only cold steel and courage. The evening was windless and clear. The moon rose late, veiled behind thin clouds. Washington waited on a ridge north of the town, surrounded by his staff, listening. Below, thousands of men crouched in darkness, bayonets glinting faintly in the starlight. Then came the faint cry, "Advance!" and the black fields erupted in motion. The assault unfolded like a heartbeat. The muffled tramp of feet, a shout, a flash of musket fire, the thunder of a charge. Washington gripped his telescope so tightly the brass bit into his palm. He saw shadows surge up the slope, sparks bursting along the parapet, and then silence. Moments later, a cheer rose, rolling through the night like surf. The redoubts were taken. He lowered the glass slowly, exhaling for the first time in minutes. The siege was effectively won. Cornwallis was trapped, his defences broken, his supplies nearly gone. On October 17, as morning fog clung to the fields, a lone drummer appeared on the British ramparts, followed by an officer waving a white handkerchief. A murmur rippled through the Allied lines. Washington, standing outside his tent, received the messenger with formal calm. The negotiations lasted 2 days. When the articles of capitulation were agreed upon, he signed them in a steady hand. At noon on October 19, the British Army marched out between the facing lines of Americans and French. Drums beat a slow cadence. The soldiers' faces were pale with fatigue. Their once bright uniforms were stained with mud and ash. At the head of the procession, the band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Washington watched from horseback, his expression grave. He would not attend the actual surrender ceremony. Out of principle, he sent General Lincoln, who had suffered humiliation at Charleston, to receive Cornwallis's sword, an act of justice quiet and exact. When the last musket clattered to the ground, the field fell silent. Men stared at one another, scarcely believing it was over. The air smelled of powder and rain. In that stillness, the full weight of the moment settled upon Washington's shoulders. For 7 years he had borne the burden of defeat, retreat, hunger, and doubt. Now, at last, the war's turning point lay behind him. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing in the wind not triumph but relief. That night, campfires dotted the hills like fallen stars. The soldiers sang, the French officers toasted liberté and la gloire, yet Washington withdrew to his tent. He wrote by candlelight to Congress. "The surrender of Yorktown will, I trust, secure to our country the blessings of peace and independence." His handwriting trembled only slightly, not from excitement but from exhaustion. When the letter was sealed, he laid down his pen and sat for a long while staring at the flame. Outside, the noise of celebration drifted through the canvas walls, laughter, fiddles, voices rising in joy. Inside, he felt only quiet gratitude. He thought of the dead of the frozen bodies at Valley Forge, of the nameless men buried along the roads from Trenton to Saratoga. He thought of Martha, far away at Mount Vernon, who had waited through each winter without complaint. He thought, too, of the uncharted future that now stretched before them all. 13 states bound by victory, but divided by pride. Winning a war was one thing, keeping a nation whole would be another. "We have yet," he murmured, "to finish the greater work." In the days that followed, the Allied camp dissolved in a haze of smoke and farewell. The French officers departed with ceremony, their flags bright against the grey sky. Lafayette embraced Washington before leaving for France, tears in his eyes. "I go to rejoice in liberty, but I leave half my heart here," he said. Washington could only nod. Words had never come easily between them, but affection ran deep. By early November, the American troops were marching north again, their boots squelching in the autumn mud. Washington rode at their head, the wind whipping through his white hair. The war was not formally ended. British troops still held New York, and negotiations for peace would drag on for years. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Yorktown had broken the back of empire. As they crossed the James River, Washington paused on the ferry's deck, gazing westward where the sun sank behind the trees. The water shimmered gold beneath the fading light. He felt the enormity of what had passed and what remained. He had led a people from subjection to sovereignty, yet the victory was not his alone. It belonged to the endurance of farmers, blacksmiths, sailors, and countless nameless souls who had believed in the impossible. When he finally returned to his headquarters on the Hudson months later, snow was falling once again. The war's last embers flickered across the continent, but peace was coming. He walked alone along the riverbank, his boots crunching through ice, and listened to the wind moving through the bare branches. The river flowed south toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of every crossing, every retreat, every act of faith. For Washington, Yorktown was not triumph, it was release. The burden he had carried since Cambridge had lifted, leaving behind a strange emptiness. "It is well," he told a friend, "but I feel like a man who has been eased of his load and knows not how to move without it." In the quiet that followed, he understood that his true task was only beginning. A free people would soon look to him, not as their general, but as their guardian. The victory on the fields of Yorktown had ended one war. The harder struggle to build a nation of laws, not kings, was about to begin. He turned from the river, mounted his horse, and rode slowly back toward camp. The moon rose behind him, bright and cold, glinting on the steel of his sword. Each step of the horse's hooves echoed softly through the frost. Somewhere in the distance, a lone fife began to play a slow, mournful tune that drifted over the sleeping valley. Washington listened until it faded into silence. Then he whispered, "Peace," and rode on into the night. The temptation of power. The guns at Yorktown had gone silent, but the echo of war lingered in every corner of the newborn republic. The British ships, their sails heavy with defeat, disappeared beyond the Chesapeake horizon in the autumn haze, leaving behind fields scarred by trenches and the weary bones of men who had fought for 7 long years. For the first time since he had taken command, George Washington could look across the land without calculating its defences. The battle for independence had been won. The battle for identity was about to begin. He rode north with his army through the hollow silence of a country that was free but fragile. Roads were rutted and broken, farms lay untended, fences fallen, homesteads emptied by loss. The war had drained the nation's blood and treasure alike. Yet beneath the ruin, something extraordinary stirred the awareness that these scattered, starving states were now something greater than colonies. They were an idea made flesh, fragile as dawn, radiant as belief. Washington felt that weight upon his shoulders more heavily than the armour of war. For years he had led through necessity, not ambition. Now, as he looked upon the people who hailed him as saviour, he sensed a new and more dangerous test approaching, the test of power itself. When he reached New York in 1783, the British still held the city, awaiting the final ratification of peace. Across the river at Newberg, Washington established his headquarters and waited. The months that followed were anxious ones. The army, unpaid and restless, simmered with resentment. Congress, bankrupt and divided, debated endlessly, but delivered little. Officers whispered of mutiny. Some even spoke of marching on Philadelphia to seize the government by force. Rumours reached Washington that certain men within his own ranks were plotting to make him king. The suggestion came first in private letters veiled flattery wrapped in treachery. One officer wrote that the nation needed a steady hand to guide it, and that the title of majesty may better preserve what liberty has gained. Washington's response was silence, but the insult burned like acid. He had spent 8 years fighting to overthrow monarchy. The thought of wearing a crown felt to him like sacrilege. When the tension finally broke into the open in the spring of 1783, the event history would call the Newberg conspiracy, Washington faced perhaps his most delicate trial. The officers, unpaid and embittered, gathered in secret to discuss their grievances and to consider taking control of the government. Some urged Washington to lead them, believing he would share their anger. Instead, he asked to address them. The meeting took place in a wooden hall lit by narrow windows and guttering candles. The men stood rigid as Washington entered, tall and grave in his faded uniform. For a moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the creak of boots upon the floor. Then, in his calm, steady voice, he spoke not as general but as guardian. He reminded them of their shared suffering, their duty, and the sacredness of the cause for which they had fought. "Gentlemen," he said, "let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, not to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood." Then, as he prepared to read a letter from a member of Congress, he hesitated. From his pocket he drew a small pair of spectacles, objects few had ever seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey but almost blind in the service of my country." The effect was electric. The stern faces before him softened. Some men turned away to hide their tears. In that moment, Washington's humility dissolved all thought of rebellion. The meeting ended in silence, shame, and renewed loyalty. Power had tempted him, but he had mastered it by renouncing it. Months later, in September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, recognizing the independence of the United States. The war was officially over. When news reached Newberg, Washington walked alone by the Hudson for hours before returning to his tent. He wrote to Congress, "The great object for which I had the honor to contend is accomplished. I now bid adieu to arms and to public life." He kept his word. On the 25th of November 1783, the last British troops evacuated New York City. Washington entered with quiet dignity, riding at the head of his officers through streets lined with cheering citizens. Church bells rang, flags unfurled, and tears flowed freely. But his face remained solemn. Victory was not a spectacle to him. It was a duty fulfilled. A few weeks later, on December 4, he gathered his officers at France's Tavern to bid them farewell. The room was warm with firelight and sorrow. The men who had shared his hardships, Knox, Hamilton, Greene, stood in silence as he entered. His voice trembled slightly as he raised his glass. "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honourable." One by one, they approached him. Washington clasped each man's hand in silence, embracing them as brothers. No words could match the weight of what they had endured together. Then, without fanfare, he stepped into the cold December air and mounted his horse for the journey to Annapolis, where Congress awaited his final act. The ride south was solemn. Snow drifted across the frozen fields. The land lay still beneath a sky of pewter. Villagers came to their doors as he passed, bowing or waving. Children ran beside his horse, shouting his name. In every town, bells tolled as though for a passing hero returning to myth. But Washington neither smiled nor stopped. He rode as a man, eager not for glory, but for release. On the 23rd of December, 1783, in the State House at Annapolis, he stood before Congress to resign his commission. The hall was silent, except for the crackle of the fireplace and the faint creak of wooden benches. The delegates rose as he entered, dressed in the plain blue coat of his command. In his hand he carried the parchment that had given him absolute power over the army, and with it the chance to seize a nation. He began to speak in a low, steady voice. "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theatre of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." For a moment, his composure wavered, his eyes glistened. "I consider it an indispensable duty," he continued, "to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God." Then, bowing deeply, he handed his commission to the President of Congress. No conqueror in history had ever done such a thing. When Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, he had marched on Rome to seize power. When Cromwell had won his civil war, he had ruled as dictator. But Washington, standing before the representatives of a free people, laid down his authority and went home. The room remained silent as he left. Many wept openly. Thomas Jefferson would later write, "The moderation and virtue of a single character probably saved the world from disaster." Washington returned to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve. Snow was falling over the Potomac. The house glowed with candlelight. Martha waited at the door, her face pale with disbelief that the long years of war were truly done. He dismounted, removed his gloves, and took her hand. Neither spoke. They simply stood together, the silence of home surrounding them. The next morning he rose before dawn, as he had always done. He walked the grounds, inspecting fences, touching the bark of old trees, watching the river move beneath the frost. The peace of ordinary labour returned to him like an old companion. He recorded the weather in his journal, noted the yield of wheat, and wrote to friends of his, intention never again to hold office. "I am become a private citizen," he said, "on the banks of the Potomac, under my own vine and fig tree." For a time, he kept that promise. He oversaw his farms, experimented with new crops, rode among his fields in quiet satisfaction. Visitors found him dressed plainly, polite but reserved. He entertained old comrades with wine and conversation, but avoided talk of politics. His greatest pleasure, he told them, was to sit under my own roof, none to make me afraid. Yet even in peace, he could not escape the world he had helped create. Letters arrived daily from across the states, pleas for advice, for judgment, for leadership. The Confederation government, weak and divided, stumbled from crisis to crisis. Trade faltered, debt mounted, states quarrelled like jealous siblings. To Washington, who watched the fragile experiment wobble toward anarchy, the silence of retirement began to feel like abandonment. He wrote privately to friends of his concern. "We are fast verging to a state of anarchy and confusion," he said, "when mankind, tired of freedom, will seek repose in the arms of despotism." It was the old fear made new, that liberty, undisciplined, might destroy itself. Through the long summers of the 1,780 seconds, he tended his fields and read the newspapers with a tightening jaw. He saw the dream for which so many had died teeter on the edge of failure. The temptation of power that he had once rejected now returned in another form, not as personal ambition, but as duty. He had laid down his sword to end the revolution. Now he began to realize he might have to lift his voice to preserve it. When, in 1787, delegates proposed a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, every eye turned once more toward Mount Vernon. Letters arrived imploring him to attend, to lend his presence and his virtue to the gathering. At first, he refused. He was tired, he said. He had given enough, but the tide of obligation rose too strong. By spring, he relented. "Should the happiness of mankind," he wrote, "depend upon the experiment now to be made, it would be criminal not to give it the best chance of success." Inspiration. And so, once again, the man who had rejected power found himself drawn back toward it, not for glory, but because the nation that bore his name could not yet stand without him. In that paradox lay the measure of his greatness, that the only man fit to rule was the one who least desired to. He had walked away from kingship, from adulation, from command itself. Yet even as he sat beneath the quiet branches of Mount Vernon, the world was already preparing to call him back to summon the soldier who had refused a crown, and to crown him, instead, with the burden of a republic. The revolution was over. The test of government was about to begin, a nation's father. The spring of 1787 broke soft and green across the hills of Virginia. But at Mount Vernon, the mornings began, as they always had, with the steady rhythm of a man who had built his life upon order. George Washington rose before dawn, his boots echoing on the wooden floors as he crossed to his study. The air smelled faintly of ink, parchment, and river mist. On the desk lay letters from every corner of the struggling new nation, pleas from governors, merchants, veterans, and politicians, all asking the same question in different words: would he return? Would he lead them once more? He had sworn, years earlier, never again to take public office. He had fought for peace, not power, but the country he had helped to create was unraveling. The Union of States, bound loosely by the Articles of Confederation, was collapsing under its own weight. The national treasury was empty, the army disbanded, the states at war with each other over boundaries and trade. Rebellions flared, courts were stormed, and Congress was paralyzed by fear and faction. Even Washington's patience, so enduring in war, grew heavy with worry. From his veranda overlooking the Potomac, he wrote to his friend Henry Knox, What stronger evidence can be given of the want of energy in our government than these disorders? Is it not time to seek a remedy? That remedy took the form of a call to Philadelphia, to a convention of delegates who would attempt to design a government strong enough to survive freedom itself. Washington resisted at first. He had no wish to become the pivot of politics or the symbol of ambition, but the letters grew more urgent. James Madison, brilliant, frail, determined, wrote again and again that the convention would fail without him. "Your name," Madison said, "will fill the chair and secure the respect of all America." Finally, in May of 1787, Washington mounted his horse and rode north once more. The journey was slow, the roads muddy from spring rain. Everywhere he passed, people gathered along the way, farmers leaving their ploughs, children running barefoot beside him, veterans saluting silently. They did not cheer as they once had in victory. They simply watched him go with the reverence one gives to a figure who had become part of the land itself. When he arrived in Philadelphia, the city was swollen with heat and anticipation. Delegates from every state crowded its narrow streets, their carriages rattling over cobblestones. In the chamber of the Pennsylvania State House, the same hall where independence had been declared, 55 men gathered beneath high windows and heavy curtains to rebuild a republic from the edge of ruin. As Washington entered the room, the noise subsided. Every man rose to his feet. His hair, now entirely white, caught the light like frost. His uniform, plain and unadorned, spoke of service rather than power. Without debate, he was elected President of the Constitutional Convention. He accepted with a simple bow, saying only, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair." Through that long, airless summer, as the heat pressed down on Philadelphia and tempers flared behind closed doors, Washington presided in silence. He spoke rarely, preferring to listen, his calm authority anchoring men who might otherwise have drifted into chaos. Franklin, frail and witty at 81, leaned on his cane and whispered counsel. Madison filled pages with tireless notes. Hamilton spoke with dazzling conviction. Others argued, shouted, despaired. The debates were fierce about representation, slavery, executive power, and the balance between liberty and order. More than once, it seemed the convention would dissolve. But Washington's presence, his quiet gaze, his habit of patience held them together like gravity itself. His influence, Madison wrote, silences every passion. When, after 4 months, the delegates finally produced a draft of the Constitution of the United States, it was Washington's hand that signed first. Beneath his signature, the ink barely dry, the parchment gleamed like the fragile promise of dawn. He said little at the signing, only that he prayed, "This new government may prove as lasting as it is wise." The Constitution went to the states for ratification. For months, Washington waited in uneasy silence at Mount Vernon, reading newspapers that carried fierce arguments for and against the document. In taverns and meeting houses, citizens debated whether this new charter would save liberty or destroy it. To some, Washington's approval was reason enough to trust. To others, his silence was the only assurance that power would remain pure. By 1789, the Constitution was ratified. The states had spoken, and the Union was reborn. But a question now rose that could not be delayed. Who would lead it? There was no other answer. From Boston to Savannah, petitions poured forth urging Washington to accept the presidency. The people did not see him as politician or general. They saw him as the living embodiment of the Republic's virtue. He resisted, as he always did. "My movements to the chair of government," he wrote to Lafayette, "will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit going to the place of execution." He feared failure, feared the corruption of fame, feared becoming the very thing he had once refused to be. But he also knew that refusal might destroy the fragile unity the Constitution had built. In the spring of 1789, he accepted. On April 16, he left Mount Vernon once more, his carriage drawn by 4 white horses, the road lined with blossoms and crowds. Every village he passed erupted in celebration bells, cannon fire, flowers raining from balconies. In Trenton, young girls dressed in white scattered petals at his feet, singing hymns of peace where, years earlier, he had crossed the Delaware through ice and gunfire. Washington bowed deeply to them, tears standing in his eyes. When he reached New York City, then the capital, the streets were hung with garlands, the harbour filled with ships flying every colour of flag. On the 30th of April 1789, he stood on the balcony of Federal Hall, overlooking a sea of people, and placed his hand upon a Bible. The air was heavy with silence as he swore the oath. "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." The crowd erupted, bells rang from steeples, ships fired their cannon, and tears streamed down faces hardened by war. Washington turned, bowed, and withdrew inside. His first words as president were not triumphant but humble. "Among the vicissitudes incident to life, no event could have filled me with greater anxiety." The task before him was vast. There was no precedent, no guide, no example in all the world for the leader of a republic born from revolution. He would have to invent the presidency itself. He moved cautiously, setting patterns that would endure for centuries. The cabinet system, the executive departments, the ceremonial dignity that balanced authority with humility. He refused the pomp of monarchy, choosing instead plain clothes and simple manners. Yet he also understood the power of image. When he rode through the capital, it was not as a king but as the visible symbol of unity, a reminder that freedom could command respect without tyranny. His home in New York became a place of quiet formality. Dinners were modest, his conversation polite but reserved. He disliked flattery, avoided gossip, and expected punctuality as a moral virtue. When visitors addressed him as His Highness, he gently corrected them. "Mr. President will suffice." The title, simple and unadorned, defined the office. But the burdens of government pressed hard. The new nation was drowning in debt, its credit worthless, its unity fragile. Factions began to form, one led by Alexander Hamilton, his brilliant but restless Secretary of the Treasury, another by Thomas Jefferson, the idealistic Secretary of State. Hamilton's vision was of a strong central government and a national bank, Jefferson's of agrarian virtue and limited power. Between them stood Washington, striving to hold the middle ground to keep the nation from fracturing before it could grow. He endured endless disputes over taxes, treaties, foreign alliances, and the balance between freedom and authority. His patience, once legendary, was tested daily, yet his restraint never failed. When tempers flared, he would rise from his chair, walk slowly to the window, and stare out over the city until silence fell. "Gentlemen," he would say at last, "we must not confuse our own passions with the interests of our country." For 8 years he served, steering the infant republic through its uncertain birth. He visited every region, listened to grievances, soothed fears. He insisted that the authority of law, not the charisma of leaders, would define America's strength. "The government," he said, "is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force, like fire, a dangerous servant and a fearful master." Its braze, he saw the first foreign treaty signed, the first Supreme Court convened, the first coins minted bearing the image of liberty. He also saw the first crisis, a rebellion of farmers in Pennsylvania protesting federal taxes. Instead of crushing it with rage, he acted with solemn precision, calling out the militia, riding at their head, then granting pardon when peace was restored. In this, he proved that freedom could govern itself without devouring its own children. By 1796, his hair had turned snow-white, his hands trembled slightly, and his heart yearned for home. The weight of office had carved deep lines into his face. Though urged to seek a third term, he refused. "I am not only tired of politics," he confessed, "but I am tired of public life." He wanted rest, to walk once more among his orchards, to hear the river at dawn without the echo of responsibility. In September of that year, he published his farewell address, a document more profound than any speech of kings. It was not a proclamation of triumph, but a letter of warning and love. He urged Americans to cherish unity, to avoid entangling alliances, to guard against the poison of faction. "The name of American," he wrote, "must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations." When he finished reading it aloud to his cabinet, silence filled the room. There was no applause, only the slow nods of men who knew they were witnessing the closing of an age. In March of 1797, George Washington left the capital. Crowds lined the road once more, not shouting this time, but watching quietly as he passed their president, returning to private life, his legacy already legend. When at last he reached Mount Vernon, the sun was setting over the Potomac. The fields glowed amber, the air smelled of lilac and soil. He dismounted, looked across his land, and said softly, "I am home." The war had made him a hero, the presidency had made him a symbol, but in the end, it was his restraint that made him immortal. He had turned victory into peace, authority into humility, and leadership into service. In refusing to be a king, he became something far rarer, a father of a nation. The weight of office. The early years of Washington's presidency had carried a kind of hopeful stillness, the fragile calm that follows a storm when the earth is still listening to its own heartbeat. But as his second term began, that quiet began to tremble. The new nation was no longer a newborn idea, tender and uncertain. It was now a restless child, tugging at the boundaries of its own creation. And George Washington, weary and watchful, stood at its center, neither ruler nor subject, but something harder to define, a living symbol of restraint, struggling to teach a people how to govern themselves before they tore themselves apart. By 1793, the city of Philadelphia, the temporary capital of the United States, throbbed with energy. Carriages clattered over the cobblestones, merchants shouted from stalls, and the ink of newspapers flowed faster than the rivers nearby. Inside their columns, a new kind of battle had begun, not one fought with muskets, but with words. The very principles that had bound the nation together, freedom, equality, and representation, were now being twisted and tested by the very freedom that sustained them. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, brilliant, ambitious, tireless. His plans had given the infant republic a financial spine, a national bank, a system of credit, a means to tie the 13 states into one economic body, but his vision of a strong central government made many uneasy. To them, Hamilton smelled too much like monarchy reborn. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson, Washington's Secretary of State, eloquent, idealistic, and deeply suspicious of power. Jefferson imagined a nation of independent farmers, a republic sustained by virtue rather than wealth. To him, Hamilton's schemes were a betrayal of the Revolution's spirit. Between these two tempests stood Washington, calm, cautious, but increasingly burdened. He had no appetite for intrigue, but the machinery of government demanded it. Each cabinet meeting felt like the drawing of battle lines. The arguments rose until the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Hamilton's sharp intellect met Jefferson's moral passion in endless debate, and when neither would yield, both looked to Washington to decide. He rarely spoke during those quarrels. He listened, hands folded, his grey eyes unmoving. Then, when the storm of words had spent itself, he would rise, walk to the window, and look out over the city. Only after a long silence would he turn and speak in his low, deliberate voice, choosing each word as though weighing its consequence upon the scales of eternity. His decisions were never impulsive and never perfect, but they were his own, drawn not from pride, but from balance. He carried that balance like Atlas carried the heavens, silently and without complaint, yet the burden grew heavier with every year. Abroad, the world was on fire again. The French Revolution, born of the same ideals that had animated America's, had descended into terror. Heads rolled beneath the guillotine, and Europe shuddered. France called upon its sister republic for support. Britain demanded neutrality. Washington knew that choosing either would risk annihilation. The fledgling United States could not survive another war. In April 1793, he issued his Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that America would pursue a conduct friendly and impartial toward all nations. It was a masterstroke of prudence and an invitation to fury. Jefferson's followers accused him of betrayal, of abandoning the cause of liberty abroad. Hamilton's supporters defended him as the voice of reason. Newspapers exploded with venom. Pamphleteers mocked him as King George I. Washington endured the insults in silence. His pride had been forged in harsher fires than print, but those who knew him saw the toll. His shoulders stiffened, his letters grew shorter, his tone, once warm, turned grave. To be the object of such unceasing attacks, he confided to a friend, is more painful than any I have yet experienced. Then came the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Deep in the western hills of Pennsylvania, farmers rose in defiance of a federal tax on distilled spirits. To them, the levy was tyranny reborn, a betrayal by the very government they had fought to create. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, burned barns, and vowed resistance. For Washington, it was a test unlike any battle before. This was not a foreign enemy, it was his own people. If he acted too harshly, he would look a despot; too softly, and the nation's authority would collapse. He deliberated for days before deciding. "The laws must be executed," he said at last, "else government is a name only." He called up the militia from several states, 13,000 men, and at 62 years old, mounted his horse to lead them west. It was the first and last time a sitting president would command troops in the field. The sight of him tall, white-haired, steady riding through the autumn mist, silenced rebellion before a shot was fired. The insurgents dispersed, order returned, and Washington, satisfied that liberty could govern itself without dissolving into chaos, rode back to Philadelphia in weary triumph. Privately, he was shaken. "To see the government I helped to form, made the object of resistance," he wrote, "has filled me with more grief than I can express." Yet he found solace in the restraint of his actions. No executions followed, no vengeance was sought. Justice was tempered with mercy, and the nation passed its first great test. Still, peace did not return to his mind. Foreign pressures mounted. The British, refusing to respect American neutrality, seized ships and impressed sailors. France, offended by the neutrality proclamation, recalled its ambassador. The young republic, caught between giants, teetered on the edge of disaster. Washington turned again to negotiation, sending John Jay to Britain to secure a treaty. The resulting Jay Treaty of 1795 prevented war but enraged many Americans who saw it as surrender to the old enemy. Riots erupted. Effigies of Washington were burned in the streets. He was stunned. The people who had once revered him as a living monument now cursed his name. When the news reached him, he sat for a long time in silence before saying softly, "After 45 years of public service, I had hoped for better." He never spoke of it again. As the second term drew to its close, his body began to betray him. The years of sleeplessness, the endless letters, the cold rides through winter campaigns, all had left their mark. His eyes dimmed, his hearing faded, and the tremor in his right hand grew worse. He longed for Mount Vernon, for the steady rhythm of the seasons, for the silence of the river at dawn. He confided in Martha that he would not seek a third term. "I am fairly worn out," he told her. "Nature will soon claim her due." But before he could step away, he had one final duty: to speak directly to the people whose trust had built his life. In the autumn of 1796, he began drafting his farewell address, a document not of politics but of philosophy, a final offering of wisdom to a country still learning how to be free. Working with Hamilton, he revised it line by line, phrase by phrase, until each sentence flowed like a quiet sermon. It was not the voice of command, but of counsel. He warned against the dangers of faction, against foreign entanglements, against the corrosion of virtue. "The unity of government," he wrote, "is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence." When the address was published, it swept through the country like a solemn wind. Newspapers printed it in full. Churches read it aloud from their pulpits. Even his critics fell silent before its gravity. In its closing lines, he laid his heart bare. "I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under a free government." In March of 1797, the transfer of power took place, the first peaceful handover in modern history. Washington attended the inauguration of John Adams, shook his hand, and departed without ceremony. The crowd, stunned by the simplicity of it, followed his carriage in silence as it rolled out of the city. When it crossed the river, the people began to cheer, but he did not look back. The weight of office had been immense, heavier than any musket, any campaign, any crown ever offered him. And yet, by carrying it with humility, he had turned burden into legacy. When he reached Mount Vernon that evening, the sun was setting in ribbons of amber across the Potomac. The scent of rain and lilac filled the air. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, and looked out over his fields. For the first time in decades, no letters waited on his desk, no armies in need of orders, no politics demanding his silence. Only the sound of birds settling in the trees, and the low murmur of the river moving toward the sea. The weight was gone, and yet he knew it was that very weight, borne without falter, that had made the nation stand. The farewell. The final years of George Washington's public life unfolded with a kind of sacred quiet, the hush that falls when a great storm has passed and the world seems to wait before exhaling. When he stepped down from the presidency in 1797, it was not with fanfare or spectacle, but with the solemn grace that had marked every step of his life. The man who had twice refused power now turned homeward to the banks of the Potomac, where he hoped at last to live as a farmer, a husband, a private citizen beneath the soft rhythm of the seasons. He rode through Virginia's spring rain along the familiar road to Mount Vernon, his white hair visible beneath his hat, his uniform replaced by a plain grey riding coat. Along the way, villagers came to their doors, doffing their caps as he passed. Children ran barefoot beside his horse for a time, laughing until the dust swallowed him from view. There were no triumphal arches, no fireworks, no soldiers saluting in ranks, just the quiet gratitude of a people watching the man who had been their symbol slip quietly back into the folds of ordinary life. When he reached the estate, the evening sun had turned the Potomac to molten gold. Martha stood waiting on the portico, her face calm and still. They embraced without words. For 40 years they had shared duty, absence, and the ever-present weight of expectation. Now, for the first time, they shared stillness. The rhythm of Mount Vernon enveloped him like an old hymn. Each morning he rose before dawn, walked the grounds, and watched the mist roll off the river. He oversaw planting schedules, crop rotations, and the repair of fences torn by storms. He kept meticulous notes, weather, soil, yields, as he always had. Visitors found him transformed not by pride, but by peace. He no longer wore the sword that had followed him through half a century. His hands, roughened by labour, touched every detail of his home with affection. He spoke often of his wish to remain forgotten by politics. "I am fairly out, and devoutly wish to remain so," he wrote to Alexander Hamilton. Yet letters still arrived by the dozen each day, requests for his opinion, petitions for his endorsement, invitations to return to the public stage. He answered most with gentle refusal. "Let me enjoy the shade of my own vine and fig tree," he said. "I have earned it." But he could never truly escape the nation he had helped create. Its pulse beat within his silence. He followed debates in Congress, with the watchful eye of a father observing the quarrels of grown children. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans, born from the rival visions of Hamilton and Jefferson, tore at each other with ferocity. Newspapers slandered, pamphlets accused, friendship dissolved into faction. To Washington, it was the very danger he had warned of. The alternate domination of one faction over another, he had written, is itself a frightful despotism. He wrote privately to both sides, urging moderation. "There is a rank due to the United States among nations," he said, "which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the internal dissensions of our own citizens." But the age of political innocence was gone. America, like every young nation, had discovered its appetite for argument. Yet even amid the noise of distant discord, Mount Vernon remained serene. Washington found solace in the company of friends and family. He rode daily through the rolling fields, his horse's hooves leaving soft imprints in the clay. He greeted enslaved workers by name, checked the progress of carpenters and gardeners, and studied new methods of soil conservation. He longed for progress, even as he carried the contradictions of his time. The estate's labour still depended on bondage, a truth that troubled him more deeply with every passing year. In private letters, he confessed his unease. "It is among my first wishes," he wrote, "to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished." But his world had given him no ready solution. Like so many of his generation, he was trapped between conviction and custom, conscience and circumstance. Yet in his will, written with the same deliberate care that had guided his commands, he took the step few others of his rank dared. He freed all those enslaved in his direct possession upon his death. It was his last, quiet act of leadership, an acknowledgement of the freedom he had fought to secure for a nation, extended at last to those who had been denied it. As the seasons turned, visitors continued to arrive, young officers seeking counsel, travellers from abroad eager to glimpse the living legend. Washington received them with dignity, serving tea in the long drawing room or walking with them beneath the linden trees. To some he offered stories of the war, to others advice on governance. He never spoke of glory, only of perseverance. "Do not conceive that fine clothes make fine men," he told one young guest. "It is character alone which makes the gentleman." At night, when the house had gone still, he would sit by the fire with Martha. The crackle of wood and the murmur of the river outside were the only sounds. Sometimes he read aloud from newspapers or the classics of Rome. Other times he simply stared into the flames, the light flickering on the deep lines of his face. He had become, without intention, the moral compass of a restless world. In 1798, as tensions with France rose toward the threat of war, President John Adams called upon him once more. The nation, fearful of invasion, begged its old commander to resume leadership of the army. Washington hesitated, torn between weariness and duty. "My whole soul is turned to domestic life," he wrote, "but should my country need me, I am ready." And so, at 66 years old, he accepted an honorary appointment as Lieutenant General and Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the United States. He did so not from ambition but from principle, to lend his name, his calm, his presence, to a government still defining its own courage. The war never came. Diplomacy prevailed, but his willingness to return, even for a shadow of command, reaffirmed what America already knew, that its strength lay not in kings or crowns, but in character. As the final winter of the century approached, Washington seemed content. The trees along the Potomac stood bare, their branches silvered with frost. He spent his days overseeing construction of a new barn, inspecting the distillery, and dictating letters in the study that overlooked the river. His health, though sturdy, had begun to wane. His voice, once powerful enough to still armies, now rasped faintly with age. On the evening of the 12th of December 1799, cold rain began to fall. Washington rode out as usual to survey his fields, ignoring the weather. When he returned, his clothes were soaked through, but he waved off concern and joined Martha for supper. The next morning, his throat burned. By nightfall, fever had set in. Physicians were summoned from Alexandria. They arrived with their instruments, their leeches, their remedies, and their fears. Washington, ever composed, thanked them politely and endured the pain in silence. As his breathing grew laboured, he dictated his final instructions, that his papers be put in order, his debts settled, and his slaves freed as his will required. He clasped Martha's hand and whispered that she should not grieve, for death, like duty, was part of life's design. At 10 o'clock on the night of the 14th of December 1799, George Washington drew his last breath. The room was still. Outside, the Potomac rolled dark and endless under a moon veiled in cloud. Within the hour, word spread through the house. The general is gone. Across the nation, bells tolled. In every city and town, citizens wept openly in the streets. Ships lowered their flags. Congress draped its chamber in black. Even in Europe, kings and ministers bowed their heads. Napoleon himself ordered 10 days of mourning in France, saying he was the only man in the world who became great without crime. Martha remained silent for many days. When she finally spoke, it was to say, "The world is in mourning, for it has lost the best man that ever lived." The funeral took place at Mount Vernon on a cold December afternoon. Soldiers fired a final volley. The echoes rolled across the frozen river. As the coffin was lowered into the family vault, the chaplain's voice trembled in the air. "Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his." The crowd stood motionless, their breath ghosting in the winter light. In that moment, a nation truly understood what it had been given and what it had lost. The Republic was no longer a fragile experiment. It had been sanctified by the life of the man who had refused to be its master. In the years to come, they would call him many things: general, president, patriot, founding father. But among those who had fought with him, who had seen him cold and hungry beside their campfires, another name would endure: the father of his country. He had taught them that leadership was not dominion, but service, that liberty was not license, but discipline, and that greatness required the humility to surrender it when the time came. His body lay beneath the Virginia soil, but his presence lingered, woven into the river's slow song, the wind across the fields, the living memory of a people who, through him, had learned to stand. The farewell of George Washington was not a moment of loss, but of legacy. In the hush of that December night, beneath the frost-silvered branches, the republic he had shaped stood trembling but alive, its heart still steady, its promise eternal. Twilight at Mount Vernon, winter passed into spring, and the Potomac shimmered once more with the light of renewal. The river seemed to carry on its surface the reflection of every season that had gone before, the frost and thunder of battle, the slow thaw of peace, the golden years of labour and quiet reward. Mount Vernon remained as it always had been, an island of calm amid the turning of the world. But the man who had given it life and order now rested beneath its earth, and yet, somehow, his presence lingered in every room, every field, every whisper of the wind through the trees. In the months following George Washington's death, silence settled over the estate. Servants and workers moved softly through the halls, their voices subdued. Martha drifted like a ghost between the rooms, her black shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She kept his study untouched, his desk, his inkstand, the worn spectacles folded neatly beside the ledger where his last entries recorded the weather, the number of barrels produced by the distillery, the yield of wheat from the lower field. Every object still held the warmth of his hand. In that quiet, Mount Vernon became something more than a home. It became a shrine to a new kind of greatness, one born not from conquest or wealth, but from discipline and virtue. Visitors came in increasing numbers. Some were old comrades who had marched beside him through snow and fire. Others were young men and women who had never seen him alive but had grown up on his name. They came to walk the paths he had walked, to stand on the piazza where he had watched the sun sink over the Potomac, to breathe the air of the place that had shaped the moral rhythm of their country. Martha greeted them with composure, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. "He loved this land," she would say quietly, gazing out over the river. It was the only crown he ever wore. The years between his death and hers were brief but heavy. Without him, she felt the emptiness of stillness. At dawn, she sometimes walked to the family vault, the sound of her steps mingling with birdsong, and stood there for long minutes without speaking. In May of 1802, 2.5 years after his passing, she followed him into that same silence. The vault was sealed once more, and the world seemed to close a final page. But the story of George Washington did not end with his burial. It began again, transformed into legend, sustained by memory and myth. Across the young republic, towns and counties bore his name. His portrait hung in schoolrooms, taverns, and halls of government. Children memorized his deeds as if they were scripture. Artists painted him in marble light, poised in eternal calm, the very image of strength without arrogance. Yet those who had known him best remembered something deeper. Not the posture of marble, but the stillness of a man who carried immense power and never let it consume him. Mount Vernon itself became a symbol of that quiet majesty. The plantation continued to operate, its fields yielding grain and fruit, its gardens trimmed with precision. The river still glimmered beneath the rising sun, just as it had when he rode along its banks. But now the place spoke softly of mortality, of the fleeting nature of glory, and of the endurance of virtue. Travellers from distant lands came to stand beneath its columns, moved not by splendour but by simplicity. "Here," one French visitor wrote, is the dwelling of a man who was greater than kings because he knew how to be a man. In the early 19th century, when the nation began to find its voice in the wider world, Mount Vernon became a destination for pilgrims. Veterans of the Revolution returned with canes and medals, their eyes dim but their memories bright. Young politicians made the journey as an unspoken rite of passage. Even strangers from Europe crossed the ocean to see the resting place of the man whose restraint had astonished their monarchs. They walked through the gardens, touched the old bricks of the mansion, and stood before the tomb in reverent silence. As decades passed, the legend grew. Historians, poets, and preachers spoke of Washington as the embodiment of divine providence, a man sent to show humanity that leadership could be pure, that liberty could coexist with order. His story was told beside firesides, in churches, in the halls of learning. He became at once real and mythic, the frontier boy who became commander, the farmer who became president, the soldier who became sage. Yet beneath the grandeur, his humanity remained. Diaries and letters revealed his doubts, his temper, his moments of weariness. They showed not a flawless saint but a disciplined man who mastered his own impulses so completely that the world mistook restraint for perfection. The paradox of his life that a man so cautious could inspire such passion became the cornerstone of the nation's identity. In his example, Americans saw both the humility and the ambition of their collective soul. The years rolled on. By the time the War of 1812 darkened the horizon, new generations of soldiers marched under the flag he had raised, believing that somewhere above them his calm eyes still watched over their struggle. When the British burned Washington City, many thought of his prophecy that unity was the Republic's true defense. His name was invoked not as mere memory, but as moral compass. At Mount Vernon, the world changed quietly around his resting place. The once rural lands began to hum with trade. Steamboats churned the Potomac. Railroads crept closer with their promise of speed and progress. But within the estate's gates, time seemed to pause. The house remained much as he had left it, the narrow staircases, the tall windows catching afternoon light, the study lined with maps and ledgers. The smell of tobacco and oak lingered faintly in the walls. Each room held the ghost of his deliberate footsteps. By the mid-1800s, Mount Vernon had begun to fall into disrepair, the great house weathered by wind and neglect. The nation, now vast and restless, had scattered its attention elsewhere. But even decay could not erase reverence. A group of women, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, gathered to save it, raising funds and restoring it as a monument to the Republic's beginning. When they succeeded, the house was reborn not as a relic, but as a living testament to discipline and dignity. Visitors came in waves, once more farmers, scholars, generals, and presidents. They stood at the railing above his tomb and felt, even in silence, the gravity of what had begun there. In that tranquil corner of Virginia, surrounded by trees that whispered with the river wind, the idea of America seemed to breathe in rhythm with the earth itself. Through the centuries, his image continued to evolve from general to founder, from symbol to myth, from myth to moral lesson. Statues rose in marble cities, his face was carved upon mountains, his name became synonymous with honesty and duty. Yet to those who knew history's quiet language, the truest Washington was still the man of Mount Vernon, the one who found greatness not in command, but in surrender, who believed that character was the foundation of freedom. The twilight of his story remains luminous even now. The house still stands, its white columns framed by oaks and magnolias. The river still moves with the same deliberate grace that matched his own. And in the vault beneath the hill, where the air is cool and still, the man who once held a nation in his hands rests within the same soil that fed his fields. At dusk, when the sky deepens to violet and the first stars rise over the water, the land around Mount Vernon grows utterly quiet. The wind brushes through the cedars, the river sighs against its banks. Somewhere, perhaps in that eternal hush, one can almost hear the echo of hooves upon gravel, the faint rustle of a cloak, the low murmur of a voice saying simply, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair." And so, long after his heart ceased to beat, his presence endures not as a monument of stone or marble, but as the unseen rhythm of a nation that still, in its better moments, strives to live by the calm example of its first and greatest servant. The twilight at Mount Vernon is not a fading, but a promise that duty, humility, and perseverance outlive all wars and all empires, as surely as the river continues its patient journey to the sea, the eternal legacy. The decades that followed George Washington's death transformed him from a man into a mirror through which a nation saw its best self. His story, already luminous in his own lifetime, became the mythology that bound the young republic together, a mythology of restraint, of integrity, of purpose. Across the swelling continent, from the cold Atlantic to the shadowed frontier, his name became a compass for conscience. To speak of Washington was not merely to recall a person, but to invoke a principle. In the early 19th century, the republic he had guided through birth began to grow with breathtaking speed. The boundaries of the old colonies dissolved into the wide horizons of the new century. Roads spread westward like arteries. Towns rose along the rivers. A restless people, still learning what freedom meant, pressed ever farther into the wilderness. They carried his image with them, painted, printed, engraved, and recited. School children traced his signature in their copybooks. Orators thundered his name at Independence Day gatherings. Even the simplest homes kept his likeness upon the wall, gazing calmly above the hearth. He had become more than memory. He was conscience itself, and yet, as the country expanded, the paradox of its promise deepened. The same republic that honoured his name now wrestled with questions he had left: unresolved slavery, division, the balance between unity and freedom. Every generation returned to his example, searching for guidance in the calm of his restraint. What would Washington have done? Became a kind of secular prayer, a measure by which ambition was weighed and excess rebuked. By mid-century, as thunder gathered once more in the American sky, his legacy took on new urgency. North and South, rich and poor, loyalist and radical, all claimed him. To one side, he represented federal strength. To the other, the sanctity of self-rule. His image adorned both arguments, his words quoted on both lips. It was as if the man who had united a people in life was destined to haunt them in division, reminding them that liberty without virtue was no liberty at all. When Abraham Lincoln rose to lead a fractured nation, he carried Washington's shadow beside him. In letters and speeches, he called the first president the mightiest name on earth, long since a mighty memory. At Gettysburg, beneath a sky bruised by war, Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom, echoing the hope Washington had once whispered by candlelight at Valley Forge. And when victory came and tragedy followed, it was Washington's steady example that guided the Republic once again from despair toward endurance. The 19th century turned, and the modern world arrived with its engines, its factories, its noise. Yet the image of Washington remained untouched, frozen in dignity. His face appeared on coins, his name on schools, counties, and cities. His monument rose in marble over the capital that bore his name, a pure obelisk pointing heavenward, as if to remind a hurried age that greatness was not noise or speed but steadiness. Beneath that monument, visitors paused to read the words carved into stone, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. But the truest monument was never stone. It was the continuity of the Republic itself, the unbroken transfer of power, the endurance of law over will, the quiet faith in a future built by reason rather than fear. That was Washington's invisible architecture, and it held. At Mount Vernon, time flowed gently onward. The river glittered with the same silver light he had loved. The gardens bloomed with the same rhythm of spring and decay. The house became a living museum, tended by hands that honoured its sanctity. Visitors came by the thousands now, schoolchildren clutching guidebooks, statesmen from foreign lands, families tracing the lineage of their freedom. They walked through the rooms, marvelling at their simplicity, the plain wooden chair, the worn boots by the hearth, the surveying instruments still arranged with mathematical precision. It was not grandeur they found there, but proportion, a symmetry that seemed to whisper that peace is the greatest achievement of power. In the stillness of the tomb, they bowed their heads before the marble sarcophagus where he rested beside Martha. The air there is cool and faintly sweet, with the scent of earth and river moss. On quiet days, the sound of birds drifts down from the trees, and sunlight spills in soft shafts through the iron gate. Pilgrims leave flowers, flags, or letters written in trembling hands. Many weep, though they cannot say why. It is not grief but recognition, the acknowledgement that they stand before the purest embodiment of what their nation had hoped to be. Through the centuries, wars have come and gone. Armies have marched beneath flags carrying his likeness. Presidents have sworn oaths beneath his gaze. Each generation has interpreted him anew. The stoic patriot of the founders, the moral anchor of the reformers, the silent guardian of the modern age. Yet through all revisions, the essence remains the same. Washington endures not because he was flawless, but because he was faithful to duty, to principle, to the quiet strength that does not shout. In classrooms, his name is still the first that children learn in the long scroll of presidents. They trace his outline on worksheets, build paper models of his monument, and repeat the story of the cherry tree. A myth, perhaps, but a myth that serves a higher truth, that honesty, even imagined, is the foundation of respect. Teachers tell them of Valley Forge, of Trenton, of Yorktown, of the farewell address. They tell them that this man, who might have been a king, chose instead to be a citizen. And in that choice, he defined the very meaning of freedom. At night, the marble of his monument catches the reflection of the moon, rising above the city that bears his name. The Potomac, flowing below, glints softly like a thread of memory binding past to present. Tourists walk its paths, unaware that they trace the same lines he once surveyed by hand. The city hums with the machinery of governance he set in motion, and though the noise of politics never ceases, above it all the tall, pale spire of the Washington Monument points silently upward, a reminder that true greatness is measured not in conquest but in conscience. If one stands there at dawn, when the light spills like gold over the river, it is possible to feel the echo of his presence. The stillness, the dignity, the unspoken balance between ambition and humility. The nation that began in rebellion still wrestles with its contradictions, its failures, its dreams. Yet, in that pale morning light, the spirit of its first leader seems to murmur through the wind, patient and unwavering. Persevere, endure, be just, and fear not. His life was the architecture of endurance, his death the consecration of principle. He proved that power can serve rather than consume, that faith can sustain without fanaticism, that greatness can dwell in simplicity. The world has produced conquerors by the thousand, but only one Washington, a man who, in learning to govern himself, taught humanity how to govern freely. And so, across the centuries, his story remains less a relic than a rhythm, the steady pulse of a nation that still measures its courage by his calm, its conscience by his restraint, its hope by his example. As twilight deepens over Mount Vernon and the river glows once more beneath the stars, one can almost imagine his voice quiet, steady, unhurried, speaking into eternity. Let us strive to deserve the freedom we have won. In that whisper lies the heart of America.